If you were living in ancient Rome during the height of the empire, your daily routine might not involve coffee, a smartphone, or a morning commute, but it could very well involve a bath, and not the sort of bath you take at home alone, with soap and a towel. No, in Rome, bathing was an act of public life, a ritual woven into the social, political, and even architectural fabric of the city. You might begin your day with errands, buying bread at the forum, checking on your work at the market. But by the afternoon, the pull of the therma, the great public baths, would be irresistible. For some, it was relaxation. For others, a place to conduct business. For many, it was simply habit, part of the rhythm of Roman citizenship. Rome had hundreds of baths, ranging from modest neighborhood establishments to massive complexes covering acres. The largest of these, such as the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian, were feats of engineering and civic pride. The baths of Caracalla, completed in the early 3rd century CE, could accommodate around 600 bathers at once. These weren't just baths, they were cultural centers. Inside, one might find not only pools of varying temperatures, but also libraries, gardens, lecture halls, and even small theaters. The idea was simple: bathing was good for the body, but the mind too should be nourished. The entrance fee was nominal, often just a small copper coin, and sometimes free, especially if an emperor or wealthy patron wanted to curry favor with the people. Thus, bathing was one of the most democratic activities in Rome. Rich and poor, freedman and senator, soldier and artisan, all could find themselves in the same steamy caldarium. The Roman bath was only possible because of the city's mastery of water supply. The aqueducts, some stretching for dozens of miles, brought clean, fresh water from distant springs into the heart of Rome. The scale was staggering. The Aqua Marcia, for example, delivered over 187,000 cubic meters of water per day. This abundance allowed the therma to operate continuously. Water flowed into the baths, was heated by massive furnaces, and then drained away. A constant cycle. The heating system, called the hypercaust, was an innovation that allowed for underfloor heating, warming both the rooms and the pools. Fires were stoked in large brick ovens, and the hot air was channeled under raised floors and through hollow walls. It was an expensive and labor-intensive system. Behind the polished marble of the bathing halls, teams of workers, often slaves, fed the fires and maintained the temperature. A single day's operation might require tons of wood. This, too, was a sign of imperial might. The empire could afford the fuel, the labor, and the infrastructure to keep thousands of its citizens warm and clean. For most Romans, the bathing experience followed a sequence. First, the apoditerium, the changing room. Here attendants kept an eye on clothing and valuables, though theft was not uncommon. From there, one might begin in the tepidarium, a warm room meant to acclimate the body. Next came the caldarium, the hot, steamy heart of the bath. This was the place for sweating. Pores opened, muscles relaxed, and the body began to shed the grime of the day. After lingering in the heat, bathers might use a strigil, a curved metal scraper, to remove sweat, oil, and dirt from the skin. Then came the frigidarium, the cold plunge. This sudden shift in temperature was invigorating and, according to Roman medical thought, helped close the pores and restore balance to the body's humors. Finally, one might spend time in the palestra, the exercise yard, or retire to the gardens and porticos to socialize, read, or nap. The bath was not just a matter of hygiene. It was a way to spend hours in leisure and companionship. In Rome, the baths were as much about conversation as cleanliness. Deals were struck in the steam. Political alliances nurtured, gossip exchanged. The proximity of senator and baker, soldier and scholar, meant that the baths were also a place of cultural exchange. Some emperors used the baths as political tools. By building grand therma, they displayed their wealth and benevolence. Caracalla, for example, opened his massive baths to all citizens, regardless of class. It was a gesture that suggested he cared for the common people, even if his reign was marked by brutality elsewhere. The bath culture was so deeply embedded in Roman life that to be denied access was a form of social punishment. In some cases, debtors or criminals might be barred from public bathing, a public humiliation. Though the baths were celebrated for their luxury, They were also rooted in Roman ideas about health. The physician Galen, among others, recommended bathing as a way to balance the humors, ease digestion, and improve mood. The alternation of hot and cold was believed to stimulate the body and prevent illness. Of course, with thousands of people sharing the same pools, the baths were also potential breeding grounds for disease. But in an age before germ theory, the warm, perfumed air was thought to be purifying. Behind the serene marble facades, the logistics of running the baths were immense. Water had to be constantly replenished and heated. Wood had to be gathered, transported, and burned in vast quantities. Attendants had to manage crowds, maintain cleanliness, and handle disputes. In this way, the baths were a microcosm of the Roman Empire itself, impressive on the surface, but dependent on a vast network of labor, resources, and infrastructure. And yet, despite the costs, the baths endured for centuries. They were not merely buildings, they were symbols of what it meant to be Roman, civilized, social, and, above all, connected to the city and its rhythms. But what happened when the empire began to strain under its own weight, when resources grew scarce and aqueducts fell into disrepair? Could the Roman passion for bathing survive the slow crumble of imperial power? When the Roman Empire was at its zenith, the thermae stood as emblems of abundance and stability. The aqueducts ran clear and constant, the wood for the furnaces arrived in steady supply, and the public's faith in the city's order seemed as solid as the marble columns that framed the caldarium. But nothing in the Roman world, not roads, not markets, not even the baths, was immune to the slow pressures of change. Bathing was not confined to Rome itself. As the empire expanded, the thermae followed the legions. In Gaul, Britain, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, Roman baths sprang up beside forums and amphitheatres, as much a symbol of Romanization as the Latin language or the military garrison. In distant Britannia, for example, the city of Bath, known to the Romans as Aquae Sulis, combined a native Celtic reverence for hot springs with Roman engineering. The baths there were both a place of relaxation and a sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva. Here, steam rising from naturally heated water mingled with incense smoke, and inscriptions in both Latin and the local language adorned the walls. In North Africa, baths adapted to hotter climates with airy designs and shaded courtyards. In Gaul, thick walls and smaller rooms helped retain heat during the colder months. The fundamental rhythm of warm, hot, and cold bathing remained, but each region added its own architectural and cultural inflections. Wherever they appeared, baths served as a reminder Rome was not just an army, it was a way of life. The empire offered its subjects more than law and order. It offered leisure. Yet the greater the bath's scale, the greater their appetite for resources. A large complex like the baths of Trajan required immense quantities of fuel each day. In the capital, wood was brought from distant forests, sometimes floated down rivers to reach the city. In the provinces, local supplies were tapped, but as populations grew, so did competition for resources. The aqueducts themselves, while marvels of engineering, needed constant maintenance. Sediment had to be cleared, cracks sealed, channels patrolled for damage or theft of water. Small faults could disrupt entire neighborhoods, and larger ones could shut down major bathhouses. Moreover, the staffing of these vast facilities was a logistical feat. Furnace tenders, attendants, masseurs, cleaners, and guards. The baths were miniature economies unto themselves. Most of this labor was performed by slaves or freedmen, whose daily work in the stifling heat of the hypercaust contrasted sharply with the leisure of the bathers above. The stability of the baths depended on the stability of the empire. During times of peace, they thrived, but war, plague, or political unrest could quickly turn them from bustling centers of life to silent, cold shells. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century CE, for example, swept through the empire, killing thousands. Fear of contagion drove some away from the baths, though many still clung to the belief that steam and scented oils could protect them. The baths, with their crowds and communal pools, may have hastened the spread of disease, though in the absence of germ theory, this connection was invisible to Roman physicians. Economic troubles, too, could shutter the baths. The cost of wood, oil, and maintenance rose with inflation. In poorer districts, smaller bathhouses began to close, leaving only the grand imperial complexes to serve growing crowds. As the centuries passed, the role of the baths began to change. Once central to civic identity, they became, in some areas, less about public unity and more about personal indulgence. In the later empire, certain bathhouses became notorious for gambling, prostitution, or petty crime. While these activities had always existed on the fringes, moralists of the time complained that the baths were no longer the wholesome meeting places they once had been. Still, for many Romans, the baths remained an anchor of daily life. Letters from the period mention friends meeting at the baths to talk politics, teachers bringing pupils for an afternoon lesson, and merchants using the palastra to negotiate trade deals. The first signs of real trouble came not from the bathhouses themselves, but from the aqueducts. These delicate systems, stretched over miles of countryside, were vulnerable to neglect and sabotage. In periods of instability, repairs could be delayed, and entire sections could be abandoned. In some cities, the flow of water slowed. Pools that once gleamed with fresh, steaming water began to grow cloudy. The proud fountains outside the baths sputtered, their steady streams reduced to trickles. In the provinces, where the empire's grip was weaker, the baths were among the first public amenities to fall into disrepair. Stones from abandoned bathhouses were repurposed for fortifications, homes, or even other public works. The sound of splashing and chatter gave way to silence. Yet even in decline, bathing did not disappear entirely. Smaller, more private bathhouses, often attached to wealthy homes, continued to operate. In rural areas, hot springs and simple sweat rooms served as humble successors to the grand therma. There is a kind of resilience in this. Even when stripped of marble columns and mosaic floors, the basic human desire for warmth, cleanliness, and community endured. Still, the grandeur of the imperial baths could not easily be recreated on a smaller scale. The vast vaulted ceilings, the intricate tile work, the sheer abundance of heated water, these belonged to a particular moment in history, one tied to the resources and ambitions of an empire at its height. As Rome entered the 4th century, new challenges emerged: political fragmentation, pressure from outside invasions, and shifting cultural values began to erode the very foundations of the public bathing culture. If the therma had once been a symbol of Rome's unity, what would their fading splendor say about the empire's future? By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the Roman therma, once the shimmering pride of the empire, were already changing character. The buildings still stood, and in some cities they still functioned, but the steady hum of their operation was no longer guaranteed. The aqueducts, those lifelines of stone and channel, now suffered from neglect or deliberate damage. Invading forces, aware of their importance, sometimes targeted them. A broken aqueduct was not merely an inconvenience. It was a wound to the city itself, depriving homes, fountains, and baths of their lifeblood. The slow decline of Rome's public baths accelerated in times of siege. During the Gothic Wars in the mid-6th century, the aqueducts of Rome were cut, either by the Ostrogoths seeking to weaken the city or by defenders who feared water supplies could be poisoned. Without a constant flow, the great therma fell silent. Pools dried, hypocausts cooled, and the halls that once echoed with voices now gathered dust. Some accounts suggest that even before these military disasters, certain imperial baths had already been partially abandoned, not because people no longer wanted them, but because the economic and logistical effort to keep them running had become too great. The decline of the therma was not solely the result of infrastructure failures. Cultural attitudes were shifting too. As Christianity spread through the empire, public bathing faced new moral scrutiny. While many Christians still bathed, cleanliness was not inherently condemned. The mixed gender and socially fluid environment of the baths drew suspicion from church authorities. Some bishops criticized the baths as sites of vanity or immorality. Gradually, the role of the bath as a civic gathering place gave way to more private forms of bathing. Wealthy households, still valuing hygiene and comfort, built smaller bath suites within their own villas. These lacked the vastness and public nature of the therma, but offered privacy and control. In the countryside, People returned to simpler bathing methods, hot springs where they existed, rivers and streams where they did not, and, in some regions, small sweat rooms reminiscent of earlier traditions. As the old baths closed, their stones and columns were often repurposed. In Rome itself, sections of the baths of Caracalla were stripped to provide building materials for churches, fortifications, and palaces. Mosaic floors were broken apart, marble cladding chipped away. In some cases, the skeletons of the buildings survived, their massive vaults standing empty like the shells of ancient creatures. The echoes of footsteps replaced the hum of conversation, and weeds grew where polished floors had once been swept daily. To later generations, these ruins became landmarks of a past both admired and mourned. Medieval travelers passing through Rome wrote of the giant halls, whose size and craftsmanship seemed beyond the abilities of any living builders. While the Western Empire's baths decayed, the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, maintained public bathing traditions for centuries longer. Byzantine baths adapted the Roman model, preserving elements of the hypocauste system and the sequence of heated rooms. These, in turn, influenced the development of the Islamic hammam after the Arab conquests of the 7th century. In this way, the Roman bathing tradition did not vanish entirely. Instead, it traveled, reshaped, renamed, and reimagined in new cultural contexts. Even in Western Europe, echoes of the therma persisted. Medieval monastic communities often had their own bathhouses, though these were smaller and more regulated. In some regions, public bathhouses reappeared in the later Middle Ages, especially in cities connected to trade routes, where travelers expected the comfort of hot water. The idea of alternating hot and cold bathing, of using steam for health, and of treating bathing as a social ritual would return in later centuries. In the Renaissance revival of classical ideals, in the Turkish bath craze of Victorian Britain, and in modern spa culture. Looking back, the Roman thermae were never just about hygiene. They were about civic identity, about the performance of belonging to an ordered and prosperous society. To bathe in the thermae was to participate in the life of the empire, to be seen, to converse, to exist within the rhythm of a city that measured its greatness not only in legions and laws, but in the warm embrace of steam. When those baths fell cold, it marked more than the loss of comfort. It was the loss of a shared space where class lines blurred, where the empire's vastness felt personal and close. Their ruins remind us that empires can fall not only on battlefields, but in the quiet dimming of their everyday luxuries. And so, centuries later, as modern cities build their own public baths, gyms, and wellness centers, one might ask, do we preserve these spaces out of necessity, or out of a deeper longing for the civic heartbeat they once provided? If you were to walk through a medieval village in northern Europe on a cold winter evening, you might smell it before you saw it, a dense, woodsy smoke mingled with the damp, earthy scent of steaming stone. Following the smell, you'd find a low wooden building, its roof sloping, its walls darkened with age and soot. This was no blacksmith's forge or brewer's hut. It was the village sweat house. The sweat house was, in many ways, the medieval counterpart to the Roman bath. But where the thermae were grand public monuments of stone and marble, the sweat house was humble, rustic, and often built by the villagers themselves. Still, the idea behind it was the same: gather people in a heated, enclosed space, make them sweat, and let the body's impurities flow out. The practice of sweat bathing in medieval Europe didn't appear out of nowhere. In many places, it was a survival of pre-Christian traditions older than Rome itself. The Finns had their saunas, the Irish and Scots their stone sweat houses, the Slavs their banyas, and the Germans their dampfwonnen. Even in regions that had once been part of the Roman Empire, the custom of using heat for cleanliness and health persisted in adapted forms. Christianity did not erase these practices, though in some places it tried to regulate them. Monks in colder climates often used heated bathrooms for health, especially in infirmaries, though theirs were simpler than the luxurious caldaria of old Rome. Rural villages, meanwhile, kept their own sweat houses going with little concern for ecclesiastical approval. A medieval sweat house was usually a small, low structure, often made of timber, turf, or stone. Inside, benches lined the walls, and in the center or at one end sat a pile of stones. These stones were heated by a wood fire, either in the same room, filling it with both smoke and heat, or in a small adjacent chamber, with the stones rolled or carried in once they were hot enough. There were two main types: the smoke sweat house, in which the fire burned inside and smoke filled the room until it was vented before use, and the clean heat sweat house, in which stones were heated elsewhere and brought in, producing steam without lingering smoke. The experience could be intense. Villagers might splash water over the hot stones to fill the room with thick, moist steam, raising the temperature until it became almost unbearable. Then came the sweating, long, slow, and deliberate. In a world with few medical options, sweating was seen as a cure-all. Fevers, aches, skin conditions, even melancholy, all might be treated by a session in the sweat house. The heat was thought to draw illness out through the pores, and the steam to cleanse the body of invisible humours or spirits that cause disease. In Ireland, for example, 15th century records mention sweat houses being used for ailments ranging from rheumatism to respiratory complaints. In Finland, the sauna was also a birthing place, its warmth thought to ease labour, and its heat to kill infection, though this was understood more through tradition than science. Herbs sometimes played a role. In some sweat houses, aromatic plants, juniper, birch, sweet gale, were thrown onto the stones or hung from the rafters, their scents mixing with the steam. These were believed to have cleansing or protective properties, warding off illness, or even malevolent spirits. The sweat house was not purely medicinal, it was also social. Families or neighbours might use it together, chatting quietly in the dim steam. In colder months, it provided a rare, deep warmth that seeped into the bones. For communities without large fireplaces or constant fuel, it could be the warmest place one experienced all winter. Seasonal rhythms played a part. In harvest time, labourers might use the sweat house to ease the aches of long days in the field. In winter, it was a place to shake off the chill. Some regions saw weekly visits as routine, others treated it as an occasional luxury tied to festivals or special gatherings. Medieval sweat houses were, by necessity, intimate spaces. In some regions, mixed gender bathing was the norm, especially in small rural communities where everyone knew each other. In others, especially under church influence, men and women bathed separately or on different days. The church's attitude towards sweat houses varied. In some areas, they were tolerated, even used by clergy. In others, they were seen as potential sites of temptation, particularly if alcohol, song, or flirtation found their way inside. Moralists sometimes lumped sweat houses with taverns as places of questionable virtue. Imagine entering one on a winter night. The doorway is low, you have to duck to pass through. Inside, the air is dim and humid, the walls glistening with condensation. The stones in the center glow faintly with retained heat, and someone ladles water onto them. A hiss of steam rises, and the temperature climbs. You sit on a wooden bench, your skin prickling as sweat beads and runs down. Someone beside you tells a story, maybe a local folktale about a spirit that hates the heat and must flee the village during a sweating night. Your breathing slows, your muscles loosen. You feel a deep, almost heavy warmth sink into you. Outside, the night is cold and still. Inside, it is as though the whole world is reduced to the closeness of bodies, the hiss of water, and the rhythm of sweat. In an age before antibiotics or modern heating, the sweat house was more than a luxury. It was a survival tool. It offered relief from cold and illness, a place for the body to mend itself, and a rare chance for quiet companionship. But while the sweat house seemed timeless, the centuries ahead would bring changes. Towns would grow, hygiene ideas would evolve, and new diseases and fears would alter how people saw enclosed, steamy rooms. Would these humble buildings survive the slow march of the late Middle Ages into the early modern world? Or would they, like so many quiet traditions, vanish into the smoke of history? By the 14th century, the medieval sweat house was a familiar fixture in much of rural Europe. From the misty highlands of Scotland to the deep forests of Finland, the basic idea remained unchanged: eat stones, heat, steam, and the shared belief that sweating could cure more than it harmed. Yet, while the heart of the tradition held steady, its surroundings were shifting. In towns and cities, sweat houses began to blend with, and sometimes be replaced by, more formal bathhouses. These urban establishments often drew inspiration from the grand Roman thermae, though in smaller, more practical forms. Many were run as businesses, charging a small fee and offering amenities like warm water basins, attendants, and even food and drink. In Germany and the Low Countries, bathhouses became social hubs, combining sweat bathing with meals and music. In some cities, they were known for being convivial, and occasionally too convivial for the liking of civic authorities. By the late 14th century, regulations were appearing, separating the respectable from the disreputable, and introducing gender-specific bathing times to curb perceived moral risks. For rural villages, these urban changes didn't immediately alter the sweat house tradition, but they hinted at a broader trend. Bathing was becoming a more organized, regulated, and in some cases, commercial activity. The physical design of sweat houses varied widely, shaped by local climate and materials. In Ireland, many were built of stone, low and beehive-shaped, with small entrances to trap heat. The interior would be blackened by years of smoke, the stones warm to the touch even after the fire died down. In the Baltic regions, wooden sweat houses stood near lakes or rivers, allowing bathers to plunge into cold water after steaming, a shock to the system that was thought to harden the body against illness. In Finland, birch twigs were used to lightly strike the skin, stimulating circulation and releasing the scent of fresh leaves into the hot air. In colder alpine valleys, sweat houses sometimes doubled as drying rooms for herbs, grains, or clothes. Heat was a precious commodity, and no space that could produce it was ever wasted. The late Middle Ages brought slow, but steady changes to medical thought. While many physicians still relied on humoral theory, some began to doubt whether intense sweating was always beneficial. Too much heat, they warned, might weaken the body or open it to miasmus. Foul air is thought to cause disease. The church's relationship with sweat houses also evolved. In regions where they had been tolerated, periodic crackdowns occurred when reports of immoral behavior reached bishops or civic councils. Some clerics argued that mixed gender bathing was sinful by nature, regardless of intent. Others took a more pragmatic view, seeing sweat houses as valuable for health, especially in monasteries and hospitals. Interestingly, sweat houses were sometimes recommended by physicians for plague prevention, though this was based more on hopeful reasoning than evidence. In plague years, some villages increased their use, believing that steam could purify the air in the lungs. The Black Death of the mid-14th century profoundly altered attitudes toward public spaces. The sweat house, once seen as a place of cleansing, could now be viewed with suspicion. Enclosed hot and shared by many, it might be seen as a potential source of contagion, even if the understanding of disease transmission was still rudimentary. In some towns, bathhouses closed during outbreaks, and rural sweat houses went unused for months or years. In others, people doubled down on sweating, hoping to drive out the sickness. The results, tragically, were mixed at best. Despite these doubts, sweat houses did not vanish. In isolated rural areas, they remained essential. Winters were long and cold, labor was physically demanding, and other forms of bathing were impractical. Sweat houses provided a kind of whole body washing that buckets of cold water could not match. They also retained their role as social equalizers. Inside, distinctions of wealth and rank mattered less than outside. The farmer, the miller, the local healer, all sat on the same benches, breathing the same steam. In smaller villages, these moments of warmth and proximity helped knit the community together. Some villages adapted their sweat houses to meet new fears. Ventilation improved, sessions were shortened. In a few cases, herbal smoke was used before steaming, not only for its scent, but in the belief that it cleans the air of unseen dangers. Others made seasonal adjustments, limiting use during plague summers and reserving the practice for the safer winter months. In certain areas, the sweat house became a more private affair, used by families or close groups rather than the whole village at once. By the end of the 15th century, the medieval sweat house was at a crossroads. In cities, Ornate bathhouses were evolving into early versions of the spa, catering to the wealthy with perfumed waters and hired musicians. In the countryside, the old smoke-filled huts still stood, but whispers of unhealthy vapors and moral unease were beginning to erode their place in daily life. Would these simple, functional buildings survive the new age of commerce, medicine, and morality that the early modern world was bringing? Or would they be swept aside by the promise of cleaner, brighter, and more controlled forms of bathing? By the dawn of the 16th century, much of Europe was in the midst of transformation. Printing presses were spreading new medical theories. Urban life was changing the way people approached hygiene, and religious upheavals were beginning to redraw the moral landscape. In this shifting world, the old sweat houses faced both direct challenges and subtle pressures to change. Yet they remained stubbornly persistent in many corners of the continent. One of the strongest forces acting against the sweat house tradition in the early modern era was a growing suspicion of public bathing in general. Physicians influenced by Galenic theory began to argue that excessive heat opened the pores too much, making the body vulnerable to disease. In an age increasingly defined by outbreaks, from plague to smallpox, anything that could be framed as a risk was subject to scrutiny. The Protestant Reformation also left its mark. In many Protestant regions, moral reformers targeted not only taverns and theatres, but also bathhouses and sweat huts. Even when no evidence of immorality could be found, the idea of mixed gender sweating was treated with distrust. In Catholic areas, the Church often held a more pragmatic stance, but it too imposed stricter rules in some places. Despite these pressures, there were regions where the sweat house tradition endured well into the modern era. The remoteness of certain landscapes. The Scottish Highlands, the Irish West Coast, the forests of Finland and Karelia, allowed local customs to continue largely untouched by urban trends. Here, sweat houses remained part of seasonal life, used for childbirth recovery, illness treatment, or post-harvest relaxation. In Finland, the sauna not only survived but flourished, eventually becoming a core part of national identity. In rural Ireland, small stone sweat houses were still being built into the 18th and even early 19th centuries, often tucked into hillsides or near water sources. Many were no longer communal in the broad sense, but served extended families or small neighborhoods. In some places, the sweat house adapted to changing medical thinking. The idea of alternating heat and cold, sweating followed by immersion in cold water or snow, was reframed in the 17th and 18th centuries as a way to strengthen the constitution. Physicians who dismissed the sweat house for curing might still recommend it for easing joint pain or improving skin health. The herbal aspect of sweat houses also evolved. Juniper steam, for example, was cited in folk medicine as a way to disinfect the air. Birch branches continued to be used in the Baltic tradition, and some Central European sweat houses began incorporating vinegar washes or scented oils between heat sessions. As towns and cities grew, public bathing shifted toward more formal establishments, sometimes modeled on the Turkish hammam or the German Kurhaus. These facilities offered better ventilation, controlled temperatures, and clear gender separation. For many people, the old smoke-filled sweat house began to seem backward or even dangerous. By the 18th century, in much of Central and Western Europe, the sweat house was fading from everyday life. Those that remained in use often did so quietly, in places where tradition outweighed outside opinion. In other areas, they survived as auxiliary buildings, used for smoking meat, drying herbs, or as storage, their original purpose remembered only by older generations. Archaeologists and local historians have documented the last working Irish sweat houses in the 19th century. These small, rounded stone huts, often built without mortar, could still be heated until the stones glowed. Villagers remembered them as places of comfort in illness, especially for those with rheumatism or chest complaints. By then, however, they were already becoming symbols of a bygone way of life. Visitors wrote about them in the language of nostalgia, describing the sensation of sitting in the dim, hot space, listening to the hiss of water on stone, and feeling the deep warmth seep into weary limbs. Though the medieval sweat house largely disappeared in much of Europe, its spirit lingers. The Finnish sauna, the Russian banya, the Estonian sutsasaun, and even the concept of the modern steam room all share its basic principle: heat, sweat, and the cleansing power of steam. In recent decades, some communities have rebuilt sweat houses for cultural preservation or tourism, framing them as living history. Others have revived them for wellness purposes, blending old techniques with new understandings of hygiene and health. The medieval sweat house was never about luxury. It was about necessity, tradition, and the comfort of shared warmth in a cold world. Its survival in certain regions, against waves of medical skepticism, religious reform, and urban change, speaks to the deep human need for spaces where the body can rest, heal, and simply be warm. Today, when we step into a spa steam room or a rustic sauna, we are, knowingly or not, echoing the footsteps of villagers who once ducked into low, smoky huts on winter nights. We are keeping alive a practice that, for centuries, offered both relief and connection in a world where survival was often uncertain. And perhaps it's worth asking, in an age of individual comforts and climate-controlled rooms, have we lost something of the communal warmth that those humble, smoky spaces once provided? In the heart of an Ottoman city, the hammam was more than a place to wash. It was a place where heat, water, and ritual came together in a rhythm that could feel timeless. You might hear the faint drip of water before you entered, the sound muffled by thick stone walls. Inside, the air was always warm, the light dim, and the pace slower than the street outside. The hammam, as it came to be known in the Ottoman Empire, drew from two powerful traditions: the Roman thermae and the Islamic concept of ritual purification. The Romans had perfected the large-scale public bathhouse with heated floors, hot rooms, and complex plumbing systems. The early Islamic caliphates, inheriting parts of this infrastructure, reinterpreted it within the framework of religious cleanliness, or tahara. By the time the Ottomans rose to power in the late 13th century, they inherited a geography dotted with old Byzantine and Roman baths, as well as Islamic bathhouses from earlier rulers. They blended these influences into something distinctly Ottoman, more intimate than a sprawling Roman therma, yet grander than the simplest village steam room. A hammam's design followed a sequence meant to guide the body gradually from the outside world into the world of heat and cleansing. First came the soyan molek, the dressing room, often a high, domed chamber with wooden cubicles, low couches, and a fountain at the center. The light here was brighter, the air cooler, and the sound of voices carried easily. From there, visitors stepped into the clock, the warm room, which acted as a transition. The air was gently heated, allowing the body to adjust. Here, one might sit on marble benches, sip water, or prepare the skin for the heat ahead. Finally came the haret, the hot room, the core of the hammam. This chamber was usually circular or octagonal, its dome pierced with small glass, covered openings that let in shafts of sunlight or lamplight. In the center lay the gubektai, the navel stone, a large, heated marble platform where bathers lay to sweat, loosen their muscles, and prepare for the washing rituals to follow. The heating system, called kiyu-lon, burned wood beneath a network of hollow brick channels, warming both the floors and the central stone platform. This indirect heat created a steady, penetrating warmth without open flames in the bath chambers. In the hot room, the air was thick and moist from occasional ladles of water poured over heated surfaces. The marble seemed to radiate warmth into the bones, encouraging the slow, almost meditative pace that was part of the hammam experience. In Islamic culture, cleanliness holds deep spiritual significance. Before prayer, worshippers perform wudu, a partial ablution, and in certain circumstances, ghusl, a full body purification. The hammam was an ideal place for the latter, offering privacy, plentiful water, and a dedicated space for thorough cleansing. But while the hammam served religious needs, it was equally a part of daily life. People came before important events, weddings, births, or circumcisions, to prepare both body and spirit. Women gathered in the hammam to socialize, exchange news, and sometimes even negotiate marriages. Men conducted business conversations or celebrated military victories. In the Ottoman social world, the hammam had a curious quality. It was both public and private, both intimate and formal. It was a place where status could momentarily fade. The rich and the poor, though sometimes separated by timing or by specially reserved facilities, shared in the same cycles of heat, scrubbing, and cooling. Unlike the noisy market or the tense court, the hammam encouraged a slower, more deliberate conversation, punctuated by the sound of splashing water and the quiet scrape of a kiss mitt on skin. A visit to the hammam was not a solitary act. Attendants, known as telak for men or nata for women, guided the process. They were trained in massage, scrubbing, and sometimes in mixing herbal rinses or oils. The scrubbing mitt, made of coarse camel hair or goat hair, removed dead skin in rolls that were strangely satisfying to see. These attendants often worked in the same hammam for decades, knowing the regular clients by name, remembering their preferences for heat, water temperature, or pressure in massage. While the hammam clearly fulfilled a hygienic function, it was also a place of healing and comfort. People with stiff joints, coughs, or skin conditions might visit regularly, believing the heat and steam could draw out illness. Pregnant women used the hammam to ease back pain. Soldiers returning from campaign washed away months of grit and fatigue. Even without medical evidence by modern standards, the sheer relief of warmth and thorough cleansing made the hammam an anchor in Ottoman urban life. By the end of this first section, we've only stepped into the Soyunmoluk and felt the first breaths of steam in the Hararet. The deeper layers of ritual, architecture, and daily rhythms remain to be explored, along with how the hammam tied itself to the empire's identity. Stepping onto the Göbek Tai, the large heated marble at the center of the hot room, was like surrendering to a slow tide of warmth. It wasn't simply about feeling hot, it was about letting that heat seep into muscles and joints until the body softened. Ready for the next stage of care, a typical hammam visit followed a pattern that changed little over the centuries. After spending some time in the El-Kluk to adjust to the warmth, a bather would move into the Hararet. Here the first task was not washing, but sweating. This period of quiet heat allowed pores to open, loosened dirt from the skin, and readied the body for the scrubbing that followed. The telak or nata, the bath attendants, would know by touch when a guest's skin was warm enough to begin. The scrubbing mitt, or case, was deceptively simple, a flat piece of rough cloth or animal hair stitched into a loose glove. With practiced, firm strokes, the attendant would scrape away layers of dead skin. This was not a gentle spy exfoliation, but a vigorous act that could leave the skin flushed and warm. The rolls of skin that collected were visible proof of the process. Some bathers found this mildly embarrassing, others took pride in seeing how much old skin they had shed. It was part of the culture of thoroughness. When you left a hammam, you left not only cleaner, but physically lighter. Once the scrubbing was complete, the attendant would prepare soap, often olive oil, based and highly scented with herbs or flowers. The soap was whipped into foam using a cloth bag, creating clouds of warm, fragrant bubbles. This foam was poured over the body in generous amounts, followed by a slow, methodical washing. In the best hammams, water was ladled from marble basins, using metal tas bowls, each splash warm enough to comfort without scalding. Some hammams offered a massage after washing. Ottoman massage was direct and practical, kneading the back, stretching the arms, loosening shoulders, and sometimes even cracking joints with a quick twist. It was as much about restoring mobility as it was about relaxation. Attendants developed skill through repetition, often learning from older workers who had themselves been taught decades earlier. The methods could vary slightly by region. In Istanbul, massage tended toward firm but steady pressure. In Anatolian towns, more stretching and joint work was common. After rinsing away the soap, some visitors chose to be anointed with light oils, almond, rose, or sometimes sesame. These were not simply perfumes. Oils helped seal moisture into freshly scrubbed skin, offering protection against the dry air outside. The use of scent in hammams was subtle but deliberate. Fragrance played a role in Islamic traditions of cleanliness, symbolizing both physical and spiritual purity. The Prophet Muhammad was recorded as having an affection for perfume, and in Ottoman cities, Scented oils and incense extended that association into everyday life. For many, the hammam was also a stage for conversation. Women's sessions, often held in the daytime, could be lively, with chatter echoing under the dome, the occasional song, and shared trays of sweets brought from home. A bride-to-be might be escorted to the hammam by her female relatives for a gelin hammam, or bridal bath, where henna was applied to her hands and feet in preparation for the wedding. Men's sessions, more common in the evenings, were often quieter, though business deals could still be discussed between rounds of scrubbing and cooling. The hammam was one of the few places where men of different ranks could share the same environment without rigid protocol. Ottoman hammams were carefully designed to enhance these rituals. Marble surfaces held heat evenly. Domes amplified sound in a way that softened voices into a gentle hum. Star-shaped skylights let in just enough light to keep the space serene but not dim. Water channels were hidden behind the walls, ensuring the constant flow of hot and cold water without distracting the eye. In large cities like Istanbul or Bursa, hammams could be vast and richly decorated. Carved marble, painted tiles, calligraphic panels quoting verses about cleanliness. In smaller towns, they were simpler but no less central to community life. A visit to the hammam could last an hour or 3. There was no strict clock inside. The rhythm was guided by the body's needs. When you had sweated enough, you moved to washing. When you were thoroughly washed, you cooled down in the L clock before dressing again. Many bathers spoke of a post-hammam calm, a looseness in the limbs and a quiet in the mind that lingered for the rest of the day. Some described sleeping better after a visit, or feeling more patient with daily irritations. And yet, the hammam was not only about the act of bathing, it was also a reflection of empire, its wealth, its urban design, its ideas about health and community. To understand that side of the hammam, we must step back into the Ottoman streets and see how these places fit into the wider life of the city. If you stepped outside an Ottoman hammam in its prime, you would find yourself at the center of a small social ecosystem. The hammam was never an isolated structure. It was often positioned near a mosque, a marketplace, or a caravanserai. In Ottoman urban planning, this was no accident. Bathhouses drew people in, and where people gathered, trade and conversation followed. Many hammams were built as part of a waqf, an Islamic charitable endowment. Wealthy patrons, often sultans, viziers, or their families, funded these buildings so that the income they generated could support public works. A hammam might, for example, fund a school, repair a mosque, or provide stipends for the poor. This meant that visiting the hammam was not only a matter of cleanliness or leisure, it was also, indirectly, an act of contributing to the welfare of the community. Every coin spent on an entrance fee rippled outward into the life of the city. Certain life events were almost inseparable from a hammam visit. For women, the gelin hammam, the bridal bath, was as important as the wedding itself. It was a full-day affair singing, gifting, applying henna, and preparing the bride for married life. There were also lohusa hammamlar, baths for new mothers, held around the 40th day after childbirth, when women were traditionally welcomed back into public life. Even circumcision celebrations for boys sometimes included a hammam visit as part of the festivities. From a health perspective, hammams were crucial. In cities without modern plumbing, they were often the only reliable source of hot water for large numbers of people. Their constant circulation of heated water and steam could even act, unintentionally, as a kind of primitive hygiene infrastructure, slowing the spread of certain skin diseases and helping to maintain overall cleanliness. Physicians of the time sometimes recommended hammam visits as part of treatment for ailments, ranging from joint stiffness to digestive trouble. While the medical reasoning might not always align with modern science, the benefits of warmth, cleanliness, and relaxation were tangible. The hammam's golden age began to wane in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The spread of piped water, home bathrooms, and changing social customs meant fewer people needed public bathhouses. By the mid-20th century, many hammams in smaller towns had closed, their marble floors falling silent. Those that survived often did so by shifting their role, appealing to tourists curious about Ottoman traditions, or marketing themselves as luxury spa experiences rather than everyday necessities. Even today, in cities like Istanbul, Bursa, or Sarajevo, you can find centuries-old hammams still in use. Some have barely changed in appearance since the days when sultans ruled the empire. Their domes still filter light through the same star-shaped holes. The marble basins still echo with the splash of ladles. For many visitors, stepping into one of these spaces is like crossing into another time, where bathing was both a public duty and a personal pleasure, and where the rhythms of heat, water, and conversation shaped the social life of a city. The hammam reflects an Ottoman vision of life that valued both the body and the community. It was a space where social hierarchies softened, where a merchant, a craftsman, and a janissary might sit side by side, wrapped in the same simple cotton cloth, equal under the steam. It also shows the empire's genius for adaptation. The Ottomans inherited the bathhouse from the Romans and Byzantines, but reshaped it to fit their cultural, religious, and architectural values. They turned a simple act, washing, into a deeply layered ritual that served the needs of health, sociability, and spirituality all at once. In the quiet after a hammam visit, when the skin is warm, the limbs are heavy, and the scent of rosewater lingers faintly in the air, one might ask, was the real purpose of the hammam to cleanse the body, or to remind people, in the middle of their busy lives, to slow down and simply exist for a while? If you were traveling through a small Russian village in the 17th century, you might notice a low, wooden building set apart from the houses, its roof sloping steeply under the weight of snow. A thin ribbon of smoke would curl from a chimney, and in the air you would catch the faint scent of birch, wood smoke, and hot resin. This was the banya, the Russian steam bath, a structure as essential to daily life as the well or the hearth. The Russian banya is older than Russia itself. Its origins stretch deep into the practices of the Eastern Slavs, and perhaps even earlier to the communal bathing traditions of the Finnic and Baltic peoples. Archaeological finds suggest that steam bathing was practiced in the region as early as the 10th century. The earliest banyas were simple log cabins, built with the same tools and joinery used for peasant homes. The difference was in the interior. The walls were sealed with clay or moss to trap heat, and inside, stones were piled onto a sturdy hearth. These stones were heated for hours by a wood fire until they glowed faintly. When water was thrown over them, they hissed, and the enclosed air filled with dense, hot steam. By the time of the Muscovite Tsardom in the 16th and 17th centuries, banyas had developed into a distinct architectural form. Most had 2 rooms, an aprylnya, or changing room, and a perilka, the steam room itself. The perilka was small, dim, and entirely lined with wood, often pine or spruce, which could withstand the constant changes in temperature and humidity. Benches were built in tiers, with the highest tier being the hottest. The air could range from a tolerable warmth at the lower benches to a blistering heat near the ceiling. Experienced bathers knew exactly how to shift between these levels to regulate their temperature. Central to the banya was the kamenka, the stove filled with the famous boiling stones. These were river rocks or granite, chosen because they would not crack under repeated heating. A wood fire would heat the stones for hours before the bathing began. Once the fire burned down, the chimney might be closed to keep the heat in, or in older, black banyas, chernaya banya, the smoke was simply allowed to fill the room before being vented through a small opening in the wall or roof. In the black banya, the smoke left a layer of soot on the walls, which might seem unpleasant, but was believed to have antibacterial properties. Despite its rustic appearance, many villagers swore that a black banya left you feeling cleaner than any other. No description of a banya would be complete without the venik, a bundle of leafy birch twigs bound together with twine. At first glance, it looks like a switch for punishment, but in the banya, it served an entirely different purpose. Bathers would lightly strike or massage themselves or each other with the venik, the leaves releasing oils that carried a sharp, green fragrance. This was said to stimulate circulation, open the pores, and drive toxins out through sweat. The birch tree had deep cultural significance in Russia. In folk medicine, birch leaves were prized for their cleansing qualities, and in folklore, the tree symbolized renewal and protection. Bringing birch into the banya was more than a practical choice. It was an affirmation of seasonal cycles and the turning of the year. In rural Russia, the banya was more than a bathhouse. It was a gathering place and a stage for life's key events. Brides were bathed in the banya before their wedding day, not unlike the Ottoman bridal hammam. Women gave birth in the warm, humid air of the banya, which midwives found ideal for easing labor. Sick villagers were brought here to sweat out fevers. After funerals, mourners sometimes bathed together in the banya to wash away the dust of the grave. This communal aspect meant that the banya was as much about shared experience as it was about cleanliness. In small villages, it might be the one place where all social divisions temporarily dissolved. The merchant, the farmer, the old widow, and the village youth all sat side by side in the same heat, bare skin equalizing status. The Orthodox Church's view of the banya was complicated. On one hand, it approved of cleanliness and considered bathing a healthy practice. On the other, the banya was often associated with pagan rituals, folk medicine, and even superstition. In rural areas, people told stories of bannock, mischievous spirits who lived in the bathhouse and could scald or scratch a disrespectful bather. Some priests tried to regulate or Christianize banya customs, while others simply tolerated them as an unmovable part of village life. The reality was that no amount of preaching could separate Russians from their banyas. They were too deeply embedded in the rhythms of the week, especially in winter when warmth and steam were precious. As we leave the first stage of our exploration, the banya emerges not merely as a building, but as a microcosm of Russian rural life. A place where the physical, social, and even the spiritual converged. But how did this humble log cabin of steam evolve into a national symbol, loved by both peasants and Tsars? If in the village the banya was a low, smoke-scented log cabin on the edge of a field, in the great cities of Russia it took on a grander scale. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as urban life expanded and public hygiene became a matter of civic pride, banyas were no longer just peasant bathhouses. They became sprawling public institutions, sometimes as large as small palaces. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities had dozens of public banyas by the mid-1800s. These urban bathhouses were often brick, built and designed with elaborate interiors. Instead of one simple steam room, they offered a series of heated chambers, each at different temperatures, so bathers could progress gradually from mild warmth to intense steam. The most famous of these was the Sanduny Banya in Moscow, founded in 1808 by Sila Sandunov, an actor in Catherine the Great's court. By the late 19th century, the Sanduny was a monument to the Russian love of bathing. Vast halls with high ceilings, marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and brass samovars in the lounge areas. A peasant stepping into such a place would have found it almost intimidating. A cathedral of steam. Yet for all their grandeur, the purpose of these banyas remained the same as in the village: to sweat, to cleanse, and to socialize. Urban banyas were typically divided by gender and, in some cases, by social class. The wealthiest patrons could rent private rooms, while the working class crowded into the public steam halls. It was not unusual for the cheapest sections to be packed with men sitting shoulder to shoulder on the benches, the air so thick with steam you could barely see the opposite wall. The price of admission in the mid-19th century could be as little as 5 kopecks for a basic entry, cheap enough that laborers and factory workers could afford a visit once or twice a week. Wealthier bathers enjoyed luxuries such as private attendants, scented soaps, and tea service between steam sessions. Whether in a palace, like banya, or a village hut, the ritual followed a familiar pattern. First, you undressed in the aprilnya or, in an urban bathhouse, in a changing hall with numbered hooks and benches. Then you stepped into the steam room to let the heat open your pores. After some minutes, you would begin the Venic massage, either done by yourself or with the help of a professional banshik who wielded the birch bundle with practiced skill. In winter, the most invigorating part came next: the cold plunge. Urban banyas had stone basins or small pools filled with icy water. Village bathers might simply roll in the snow or jump into a nearby river if it wasn't frozen solid. The sudden shock to the body was believed to boost circulation and harden the constitution. Finally, you might return to the steam room for another round, finishing with soap, scrubbing, and rinsing. This was followed by a rest in a cooler room where people drank tea, played cards, or quietly dozed. By the 19th century, Russian physicians had begun to write approvingly of the banya's health benefits. It was recommended for respiratory ailments, joint pain, skin conditions, and even melancholy of the spirit. Medical journals of the time noted that regular bathers seemed to suffer fewer colds and were more resilient to the harsh Russian winters. Doctors also took note of the Venix effects. The birch oils released by the leaves were mildly antiseptic, and the rhythmic striking was thought to encourage lymphatic drainage and muscle relaxation. Even without modern terminology, practitioners understood that the banya was both preventive and restorative medicine. In urban settings, the banya also became a place of informal politics and business. Merchants struck deals in the lounge, while workers discussed wages and working conditions. In some cases, the banya was where revolutionary ideas spread quietly away from the ears of police and informants. The steam room offered a degree of privacy, voices were muffled, faces were half hidden, and few outsiders would linger uninvited. The significance of the banya found its way into Russian literature as well. Gogol, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov all wrote scenes involving banyas, using them as symbols of renewal, confession, or raw human equality. In Chekhov's plays, a visit to the banya could strip away the polite masks of society, leaving characters exposed in more ways than one. By the end of the 19th century, the banya had firmly established itself as both a rural necessity and an urban institution. But with the coming of the Soviet era, its role would change once again, adapting to new political realities, public health campaigns, and the rhythms of modern life. If the banya had been a beloved tradition in Tsarist times, the Soviet Union transformed it into a matter of policy. Cleanliness, once a matter of personal and village routine, became framed as a public duty. Hygiene campaigns emphasized that a healthy worker was a productive worker, and the banya, already part of Russian life, fit perfectly into this vision. In the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet health officials launched programs to build public bathhouses across the country, not only in cities, but in collective farms, industrial towns, and even remote outposts in Siberia. The goal was simple: ensure every citizen had access to regular washing, no matter their living conditions. Some of these Soviet banyas were enormous, designed to handle hundreds of bathers a day. The architecture was functional, stripped of the ornate decor of imperial times, but efficient. Long rows of benches, tiled steam rooms, and large cold water pools became standard. Steam was produced not only from wood-fired stones but sometimes from modern boilers, though the old practice of splashing water onto glowing rocks was still maintained where possible. Unlike in Tsarist times, when wealthier bathers could purchase private rooms, the Soviet banya was egalitarian in theory. Everyone, from factory foreman to railway labourer, stripped down in the same changing rooms. Separate men's and women's days were the norm, though in some rural areas mixed family sessions were permitted. For many working-class Soviets, especially those living in cramped apartments without private bathrooms, the weekly banya visit was not just a luxury, it was a necessity. Entire families would go together, bringing their own soap, towels, and Venix. The banshik profession survived, though now it was officially a municipal job. Even under the ideological uniformity of the Soviet era, the birch branch tradition never disappeared. Birch remained the most common choice, but oak and eucalyptus Venix became popular alternatives, each with its own scent and feel. Official health bulletins praised the practice as mechanical massage that improved circulation and muscle recovery after physical labor. In some industrial towns, the banya even served as a kind of workers' therapy clinic. Miners, for example, were encouraged to visit after a week underground to sweat out coal dust and ease joint stiffness. It was part relaxation, part recovery, and part ritual. The Soviet banya wasn't just about hygiene. It was one of the few spaces where private conversations could happen without suspicion. In the thick steam, with condensation dripping from the walls, surveillance was impractical. Many Russians recall that important discussions, from family disputes to unofficial political talk, took place in the banya, where everyone was too preoccupied with heat and sweat to take notes. This made the banya something of a social equalizer. Naked, flushed, and dripping, people stood on equal footing, stripped of uniforms and status symbols. A factory director might sit beside a lathe operator, both enduring the same stinging venic strokes and plunging into the same cold pool afterward. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, many municipal banyas fell into disrepair, victims of budget cuts and privatization. Some were converted into fitness centers or luxury spas, others closed entirely. But in many towns and villages, the tradition persisted, sometimes in modernized facilities, sometimes in humble backyard banyas, little changed from the 18th century. Today, the banya has seen something of a revival. In cities like Moscow, historic bathhouses, such as the Sanduni, have been restored, attracting both locals and tourists. Boutique banyas cater to those seeking a luxury wellness experience, complete with herbal infusions, essential oils, and spa menus. Meanwhile, in the countryside, people still gather in simple log huts, stoking the fire for hours before the first session of steam. To outsiders, the banya might look like just another form of sauna, but to Russians it holds a deeper meaning. It is a place of renewal, where the sweat carries away the week's weariness, and where the sting of birch leaves feels like a cleansing penance. It is both ancient and modern, communal and personal, a space where traditions older than the state itself have survived empires, revolutions, and ideologies. Even today, it is common to hear the phrase, "The banya washes away more than dirt." This could mean physical renewal, emotional release, or simply the quiet satisfaction of stepping into the freezing air after a good sweat, feeling your skin tingle and your mind clear. The banya, in its many forms, remains a testament to the Russian belief that health is not just about medicine, but about ritual, and that sometimes the best cure for life's burdens is to sit in a room of steam, strike your skin with fragrant branches, and emerge into the cold with lungs full of clean air. In much of early modern Europe, bathing had long been a neglected habit. By the dawn of the 18th century, centuries of suspicion toward bathing still lingered. Medieval physicians had warned that hot water opened the pores to disease, and public bathhouses had been shut down in many cities during plague years. For the wealthy, cleanliness was often a matter of linen changes and perfume, rather than actual immersion in water. A nobleman could go months without a full bath, and a peasant might go a lifetime without one. But something shifted as the 18th century unfolded. Across the courts of Europe, and later in its towns and countryside, a renewed fascination with bathing emerged, a craze that combined science, fashion, and social performance. Suddenly, water, once feared as a vector of illness, was being embraced as a source of health and refinement. Part of this change came from the Enlightenment's faith in observation and reason. Physicians and philosophers began to study the human body with renewed interest, and many concluded that moderate bathing, in both hot and cold water, could strengthen the constitution, encourage circulation, and even prevent disease. The rediscovery of ancient texts helped as well. Writers like Galen and Pliny, who had praised the baths of antiquity, were cited in medical treatises. Roman ruins in places like Bath, England, and Baden, Germany, inspired architects and physicians to imagine a revival of classical bathing culture. At the same time, a growing fascination with the natural world encouraged Europeans to seek out mineral springs. The bubbling, sulfur-scented waters of spa towns were no longer seen as ominous, but as potent remedies. Physicians prescribed bathing for everything from gout to melancholy, and patients obeyed with a kind of fashionable fervor. By the 1720s and 1730s, towns blessed with natural springs began transforming into seasonal resorts. Bath in England, Vichy in France, Aachen in the Holy Roman Empire, all became magnets for those seeking both health and society. A visit to the spa was rarely solitary. Bathing was a public performance. At Bath, for instance, the Roman baths had been reconstructed into elaborate pools, where men and women could mingle in the water, fully clothed in modest bathing costumes. The warm mineral waters were not only for soaking, some physicians recommended drinking them as well, despite their often unpleasant taste. In Germany, Baden's Kurhaus offered steam rooms, plunge pools, and mud treatments alongside gambling halls and ballrooms. Health and pleasure became inseparable. Patients were told to follow a course of bathing, perhaps 3 weeks of daily soaks. But the real therapy often came from the dances, dinners, and strolls along the promenade. Bathing in the 18th century was as much about status as hygiene. The wealthy could afford extended stays in spa towns, bringing with them a retinue of servants, musicians, and tailors. Their arrival was noted in local newspapers, and their clothing and manners were carefully observed by other guests. In Bath, England, the so-called pump room served as the social heart of the spa. Here, fashionable visitors drank the warm spring water while exchanging news, arranging marriages, or quietly advancing political alliances. The water itself was almost incidental. What mattered was being seen drinking it. Even outside spa towns, bathing acquired a genteel air. Wealthy families began installing private bathing rooms in their homes, lined with marble or wood, with large copper tubs and hot water supplied by servants carrying pails from the kitchen. Not everyone was convinced that bathing was safe. While warm mineral baths gained popularity, cold water bathing, what would later be called sea bathing, sparked fierce debate. Advocates claimed that plunging into the ocean or a cold spring invigorated the body and hardened it against illness. Skeptics warned that such shocks could damage the heart or trigger fevers. Doctors prescribed different bathing regimens, depending on the patient's constitution. A man of bilious temperament might be told to soak in lukewarm waters, while a melancholic woman might be advised to alternate hot baths with brisk plunges in cold streams. Many regimens were elaborate, involving both immersion and drinking the mineral water, punctuated by walks, light exercise, and carefully measured diets. By the mid-18th century, bathing was firmly established as a fashionable pastime. Engravings and paintings depicted elegantly dressed men and women entering the water, chatting and laughing as attendants hovered nearby. Some visitors never intended to improve their health. They came for the dances, the dinners, the card games, and the chance to make a strategic marriage match. And yet, in all this performance, a quiet revolution was taking place. The very idea that water could cleanse and heal was regaining acceptance. Where once people feared that bathing could invite sickness, now they began to believe that it could ward it off. Still, for all the optimism, the craze for bathing carried its own peculiarities and contradictions, ones that would become even more apparent as sea bathing swept across Europe's coasts. While inland spa towns thrived on mineral waters and genteel promenades, a new form of bathing began to captivate the imagination of 18th century European sea bathing. What had once been a rare, somewhat eccentric practice became, by the mid-1700s, a fashionable and even prescribed health treatment. Before the craze, most coastal towns in Britain and continental Europe regarded the sea with a mix of awe and suspicion. The coast was often associated with shipwrecks, storms, and the hard labor of fishing, not leisure or health. Swimming for pleasure was uncommon. In fact, many people could not swim at all. But physicians began to notice that certain hardy individuals who regularly entered the sea, fishermen, sailors, and some laborers, seemed to have robust health. This observation, paired with the Enlightenment's growing fascination with natural remedies, led some doctors to experiment with prescribing seawater immersion for their patients. One of the earliest and most influential advocates was Dr. Richard Russell of Brighton, England, whose 1752 treatise praised the virtues of sea bathing and drinking seawater, though that part never caught on widely. Russell claimed the mineral salts, the bracing cold, and the vigorous shock of the waves could treat everything from glandular swellings to depression. Wealthy patients flocked to Brighton, transforming it from a quiet fishing village into a bustling health resort. There was, however, a challenge: decorum. In an age when modesty was paramount, no respectable lady or gentleman could be seen strolling down the beach in a bathing costume. The solution was a curious contraption that became an icon of 18th and 19th century seaside culture, the bathing machine. These were small wooden huts, mounted on wheels, into which bathers could step fully clothed from the privacy of the beach. Inside, they would change into bathing garments, typically made of heavy flannel or wool, while attendants or horses rolled the machine down a short track into the shallow water. The bather could then step directly into the sea without exposing themselves to public view. In some resorts, attendants known as dippers were employed to assist, or rather, to ensure that the bather fully immersed themselves. These dippers, often strong, weather-hardened locals, would grab hold of hesitant visitors and dunk them under the cold waves before they had a chance to protest. This was considered an essential part of the cure. Seawater bathing was thought to harden the body, much like exposure to cold air. Physicians claimed that the sudden shock stimulated the circulation, improved appetite, and even balanced the humus in the body. That old medieval theory still lingering in popular medicine. A typical course of treatment might involve bathing every morning for 2 to 3 weeks, ideally before breakfast, followed by a brisk walk along the shore. Many visitors swore by the results, reporting renewed energy and vigor. Whether these benefits were due to the salt water itself, or the simple combination of fresh air, movement, and a change of scenery was less often questioned. Bathing costumes were designed more for modesty than comfort. Women's garments resembled long, loose dresses with wide sleeves, worn over pantalettes. They became heavy when wet, making swimming nearly impossible. But swimming was not the point. Men's attire was simpler, short, sleeved shirts and knee-length drawers, also made of thick fabric. Over time, however, some resorts began to relax these rules, and lighter, more practical swimwear emerged, especially for men. Still, in the 18th century, propriety ruled, and few would have dared to stray too far from convention. The rise of seaside bathing reshaped entire towns. Coastal villages that had once lived by fishing began to thrive on seasonal tourism. Hotels, boarding houses, tea rooms, and assembly halls sprang up to cater to the needs of wealthy visitors. Carriages and stagecoaches brought in crowds during the summer months, and a new class of seaside workers emerged: musicians, dance instructors, bathing attendants, and purveyors of trinkets and souvenirs. Brighton, Scarborough, Margate, and Weymouth became names associated with fashionable sea bathing in Britain, while on the continent, Ostend in the Austrian Netherlands, now Belgium, and deep in France developed similar reputations. Nothing boosted a health fad like royal approval. When King George III visited Weymouth in the 1780s, his enthusiastic participation in sea bathing was widely reported. Accounts described him cheerfully wading into the water, attended by his physician, and accompanied by military music played from the shore. His example made sea bathing not only respectable, but aspirational for the upper classes. By the end of the 18th century, seaside bathing had become both a health treatment and a form of genteel entertainment. Resorts advertised not just their waters but their concerts, assemblies, and scenic walks. Visitors came away with stories of braving the cold waves, of being dunked by a no-nonsense dipper, of gossip shared in the shelter of the bathing machine. Still, for all its popularity, sea bathing was not universally embraced. Some physicians warned that immersion in cold water could be dangerous for the elderly or infirm. Others doubted whether any medicinal benefits existed at all. The debate, however, only seemed to fuel public interest. And as the century drew to a close, another transformation was underway, one that would shift bathing from a strictly therapeutic practice into a broader culture of leisure, sport, and personal hygiene. By the dawn of the 19th century, the seaside bathing craze had woven itself so firmly into European society that it was no longer simply a matter of following a physician's orders. The practice had become a social institution, part medical ritual, part fashionable amusement, and, increasingly, a personal habit for those who could afford to make the trip. Where once visits to the sea had been sporadic or undertaken only out of necessity, resorts now operated on a clear seasonal schedule. The summer months brought the highest influx of visitors, with August often serving as the peak of the bathing calendar. Many families plan their year around these excursions, booking rooms months in advance and packing entire wardrobes designed for seaside life. Wealthy visitors sometimes stayed for weeks, even months, enjoying not just the bathing, but the structured social life of the resort. Morning dips were followed by leisurely walks along the promenade, afternoon assemblies or card games, and evenings filled with concerts or dances. For the upwardly mobile, these gatherings were as much about being seen as they were about health. By the early 1800s, the bathing machine had evolved in both function and symbolism. In many British and continental resorts, these rolling huts were still essential for preserving modesty, but they had also become a kind of social theatre. Watching the tide of bathing machines trundle into the surf was part of the spectacle, each one bearing a bather who might be a countess, a merchant's wife, or a visiting dignitary. Some resorts developed elaborate systems for managing them. Color-coded flags indicated when the sea was safe, when the tide was ideal, or when separate areas were reserved for men and women. At the busiest beaches, dozens of machines might be in operation at once, creating a curious procession from sand to surf and back again. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, advances in transportation, better roads, more reliable stagecoach services, and eventually railways brought sea bathing within reach of the growing middle classes. No longer the exclusive domain of the aristocracy, seaside towns now welcomed shopkeepers, clerks, and skilled tradesmen who could afford a week or two away from work. This shift democratized bathing culture, but it also changed its character. Resorts that had once prided themselves on refined company began to adapt to a wider clientele. Lodgings diversified, from grand hotels to modest boarding houses. Markets and street vendors flourished, selling everything from shell trinkets to sweetmeats for the children. The medical reasoning behind sea bathing also evolved. While early advocates had stressed the shock and bracing quality of cold water, later physicians began to emphasize its invigorating effects on circulation, its ability to cleanse the pores, and its role in building physical resilience. Interestingly, while the hygienic value of bathing was increasingly recognized, daily bathing at home was still rare for most people. For many, a trip to the seaside might be the only time in a year when they immerse themselves fully in water. Thus, the association between bathing and health remained strong, both as a medical treatment and as a symbol of cleanliness. By the mid-19th century, sea bathing had spread well beyond Britain. French resorts such as Biarritz and Deauville catered to aristocrats and cosmopolitan travelers, offering not just bathing but a rich cultural scene. Belgian, Dutch, and German coastal towns developed their own distinctive seaside cultures. Rivalries arose between resorts, each boasting of its superior waters, purer air, or more distinguished visitors. This competition led to the embellishment of facilities. Grand bathhouses were built along the shore, offering heated changing rooms, indoor seawater pools for stormy days, and even cafes and reading rooms for those who preferred to watch the waves from dry land. Though early bathing was more about immersion than swimming, a subtle change was underway. Influenced by lifeguards, fishing communities, and the occasional adventurous bather, more people began to see the sea not just as a place to dip, but as a space for active movement. By the mid-1800s, swimming as a sport was beginning to emerge, aided by lighter swimwear and the idea that exercise itself could be a form of health maintenance. Still, in the early days, the act of truly swimming in open water was considered bold, even reckless, and was far from the norm for genteel visitors. The 18th century bathing craze did more than launch a fashion. It altered the European relationship with water itself. The sea was no longer simply a place of labor or danger. It became a destination of pleasure, rest, and renewal. The rituals developed during this period, the morning dip, the promenade, the seaside holiday, laid the foundation for the modern beach vacation. Even today, echoes of that era remain. The concept of the season, the appeal of a seaside promenade, and even the quaint image of a bathing hut rolling into the surf are all legacies of the Georgian and early Victorian fascination with bathing. What began as a rather stiff, medicalized ritual had, over a century, transformed into a cornerstone of leisure culture. And yet, one might wonder, if sea bathing was first embraced as a cure for ailments, what changed in the public mind to make it an end in itself rather than a means to health? Was it simply the human tendency to turn necessity into pleasure, or did something deeper shift in how society understood the role of the body in daily life? When the Victorians thought of cleanliness, they often meant something quite different from what we mean today. Soap and water were important, yes, but for much of the 19th century, clean was as much a moral and spiritual concept as a physical one. The idea that bathing could be both a moral duty and a fashionable pastime took root in a particularly unusual way. Through the arrival of the Turkish bath, as it came to be known in Britain, was a curious hybrid. It was inspired by the ancient Roman baths, filtered through centuries of Islamic bathing traditions, and reinterpreted by health reformers and architects for a British public hungry for new experiences. This was not a casual dip in a tub or a brisk splash at the seaside. It was a carefully staged ritual of heat, steam, rest, and cleansing, one that promised to cure ailments, purify the body, and perhaps even refine the soul. The Victorian Turkish bath movement owes much of its existence to a single, determined man, David Urquhart, a Scottish diplomat and traveller. Urquhart was deeply impressed by the hammam traditions he encountered in the Ottoman Empire. While stationed abroad in the 1830s, he saw not just the architecture and elegance of the bathhouses, but also the central role they played in daily life. In Turkish cities, the hammam was more than a place to wash. It was a social hub, a public service, and a form of preventative medicine. Urquhart returned to Britain with a missionary zeal for what he saw as an underappreciated form of public health. In 1850, he began to write passionately about the need for Britain to adopt this Eastern practice. To him, the bath was not merely exotic, it was a moral necessity in an industrial nation choking on soot, sweat, and poor sanitation. Urquhart's vision met with skepticism. The British were not strangers to bathing, but public bathhouses in the early Victorian period were often associated with poverty, charity, or even moral danger. Many people bathed at home, in tin tubs or hip baths, and the idea of sweating in a communal space struck some as foreign, unnecessary, or even unsavory. To counter this resistance, Urquhart emphasized the bath's medical benefits. The Turkish bath, he argued, was not simply about cleaning the skin. It was about stimulating circulation, purging impurities through perspiration, and relaxing the mind. He insisted it could help with ailments ranging from rheumatism to digestive troubles. This appeal to health, paired with his own energetic campaigning, began to draw curious patrons. In 1856, the first modern Turkish bath in Britain opened in Manchester, funded by a group of Urquhart's supporters. It was a modest facility, but it captured attention. Inside, the process followed a ritualized sequence. Patrons moved from warm rooms to progressively hotter chambers, allowing the body to sweat freely. Attendants would then scrub the skin vigorously with rough mitts before guests were cooled down with a plunge bath or shower. The experience was intense for those accustomed to a quick wash. The heat could be overwhelming, the scrubbing almost abrasive, and the shock of cold water at the end both invigorating and alarming. Yet many who tried it claimed to feel lighter, cleaner, and oddly refreshed. One of the most distinctive features of the Victorian Turkish bath was its architecture. Inspired by Ottoman and Moorish styles, many were built with domed ceilings, arched doorways, and intricate tilework. The exotic design was part of the appeal. It allowed patrons to imagine themselves transported to far off lands without ever leaving Leeds, Glasgow, or London. Yet the beauty of these buildings was also functional. High ceilings helped circulate heat, while layers of brick and tile retained warmth in the hot rooms. Ventilation systems were carefully planned to ensure fresh air while preventing the build-up of dampness or unpleasant odors. For middle and upper class Victorians, the Turkish bath became a respectable outing. Men visited for business meetings as much as for health, while women attended on specially designated days. The separation of the sexes was strictly maintained, and the emphasis on health, rather than mere washing, kept the baths from being seen as scandalous. Still, Not everyone was convinced. Some doctors remained wary of the heat's effect on the heart, while more conservative citizens muttered about the moral risks of lounging half-dressed in public spaces. The fact that the idea had come from the Ottoman Empire, still viewed by many through a lens of Orientalist suspicion, did little to help its acceptance. By the late 1850s, however, the Turkish bath was no longer just a curiosity. Facilities began to open in major cities and spa towns. The wealthy incorporated regular visits into their routines, and athletes praised the baths for improving muscle recovery. Even the military experimented with them, seeing value in their ability to keep soldiers clean and healthy. In a Britain that was still struggling with urban filth, industrial smog, and outbreaks of disease, the Turkish bath seemed like a rare and welcome form of indulgence that was also virtuous. But its future, and the height of its popularity, was still to come. The question remained, could this Eastern-inspired ritual truly take root in the heart of the industrial West, or would it remain a fashionable novelty for a select few? By the 1860s, the Victorian Turkish bath had transformed from a curious import into a national phenomenon. What began as the crusade of a determined diplomat was now a growing industry, with bathhouses springing up from Glasgow to Brighton. The public's initial wariness gave way to enthusiasm, and for a time the Turkish bath seemed to embody the era's fascination with both health and exoticism. The Turkish bath appealed strongly to the rising middle class, who sought ways to demonstrate refinement, health consciousness, and worldly taste. A visit to the bath became a ritual, part relaxation, part performance. Middle-class men might arrive in the late afternoon, after work but before dinner, using the experience as both a cleanse and a social opportunity. They would greet acquaintances, discuss the day's news, or even conclude business deals between rounds of sweating and scrubbing. For women, who were generally restricted to separate days or dedicated ladies' facilities, the bath was a rare chance to step outside the domestic sphere. The Turkish bath promised not only improved skin and hair, but also a moment of leisure in a carefully controlled environment. Fashion magazines began to recommend the bath for maintaining a youthful complexion, and advice columns discussed its benefits for nervous complaints. A typical Victorian Turkish bath followed a deliberate sequence that mixed comfort with discomfort in equal measure. Upon entering, patrons would leave their street clothes in a changing room and wrap themselves in light garments, often sheets or robes. They then entered a warm room, heated to around 100 degrees Fs or 38 degrees C, to allow the body to adjust gradually. From there, the temperature increased. In the hot room, heated by hot air passing through brick flues, the thermometer might read 150 degrees Ref, or 65 degrees C or higher. Sweat flowed freely, pores opened, and the skin flushed. Attendants, often called bathmen, offered to scrub clients with coarse mitts, removing layers of dead skin in satisfying rolls. For those unaccustomed to the heat, the sensation could be dizzying, but for regular patrons it was invigorating. The final stage was the cold plunge or shower, designed to shock the body back to alertness. Some bathhouses featured marble plunge pools, their icy depths as memorable as the heat that preceded them. The abrupt temperature change was touted as beneficial for circulation and immune health, though it could leave the unprepared gasping. Afterward came the restroom, where patrons reclined on couches with blankets, sipping tea or mineral water, while the body slowly returned to normal. Many described this phase as the most pleasurable, a rare Victorian moment of stillness. Victorian Turkish baths were often designed as miniature worlds, distinct from the grimy industrial cities outside. Architects embraced a variety of exotic styles: Moorish arches, Islamic tile patterns, domed ceilings painted with stars. Even in smaller towns, the interiors could be surprisingly elaborate, with marble floors, stained glass, and carved wooden screens. This exoticism was part of the bath's charm. It allowed patrons to imagine they were partaking in something ancient and foreign, while still within the bounds of British propriety. Travel writing of the time reinforced this image, comparing British bathhouses favourably or sometimes unfavourably to those of Constantinople, Cairo, or Damascus. By the 1870s, the Turkish bath had become a competitive business. entrepreneurs recognized its profitability, especially in urban centers where professional men sought regular treatments. Railway companies even promoted bathhouses in resort towns, combining them with hotel stays. In cities like London, some baths remained open late into the night, catering to shift workers and socialites alike. The movement also intersected with other Victorian health trends. Advocates of hydrotherapy, vegetarianism, and temperance often embraced the Turkish bath as part of a larger lifestyle regimen. The bath's ability to purify the body fit neatly into the language of moral and physical improvement. Despite its popularity, the Turkish bath was not without its detractors. Some physicians cautioned against the extreme heat, particularly for patients with heart disease or respiratory issues. Others mocked the bath as a fad for the gullible middle class, no different from patent medicines and quack cures. The more conservative public still regarded its exotic origins with mild suspicion, worrying about the impropriety of undressing in shared spaces, even when segregated by gender. Yet, for the most part, these criticisms did little to stem the tide. The Victorian Turkish bath had become an institution, and its benefits, or at least its pleasures, were too appealing for many to ignore. By the late 19th century, the movement stood at its peak. Turkish baths were thriving businesses, fashionable retreats, and, for some, an essential part of a healthy life. The question now was whether this heat-fueled enthusiasm could endure into the changing world of the 20th century, or whether it would evaporate like steam from the hot room. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Turkish bath in Britain stood at the height of its popularity. Yet, like steam dissipating in cool air, the enthusiasm that had once filled marble chambers began to wane. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but it would ultimately transform the landscape of public bathing in the United Kingdom. Several factors contributed to the slow decline. The first was simple competition. The late Victorian period saw a proliferation of new leisure and health options, from public swimming pools to indoor gymnasiums, all promising similar benefits for fitness and vitality. While the Turkish bath offered relaxation and cleansing, these newer facilities added exercise, recreation, and, in the case of pools, a more vigorous form of social interaction. There was also a change in fashion. As medical science advanced, the idea of heat as a universal remedy began to lose its authority. Physicians shifted their attention to other treatments, and the once compelling argument that sweating could cure nearly anything was met with polite skepticism. Perhaps the most significant competitor was the Russian steam bath, or banya, which used moist steam rather than dry heat. It was cooler in temperature, but felt hotter due to the humidity, and some found it less taxing on the body. Steam rooms began to appear in health clubs and sanatoria, offering a different form of bathing appealed to a generation increasingly interested in medical regimens rather than exotic spectacle. The moist steam was also easier to generate and maintain in smaller, cheaper facilities. The elaborate flues and masonry of the dry Turkish bath required considerable maintenance. A steam boiler, by contrast, could be installed in far more modest premises. By the early 20th century, the number of Turkish baths in Britain had begun to fall. Many closed due to high operating costs, while others converted into hybrid facilities offering both dry and steam rooms. Some simply became swimming pools or municipal bathhouses. The social role of the bath also shifted. What had once been a middle-class ritual was increasingly associated with the working classes, particularly in industrial cities where manual laborers used baths for both hygiene and relief from muscle fatigue. While this kept certain facilities alive, it stripped the Turkish bath of some of its former glamour. Not all was lost. A few grand establishments persisted, often by leaning into their architectural beauty and luxurious service. In London, Manchester, and Glasgow, ornate bathhouses continued to attract loyal patrons well into the interwar years. These places emphasized tradition, exotic atmosphere, and a sense of continuity with an earlier, more romantic age. Some entrepreneurs even experimented with merging the Turkish bath with spa tourism. Bathhouses in seaside resorts marketed themselves to travelers as part of a holiday experience, a day at the beach followed by a session of hot, dry cleansing. While never returning to the frenzy of the 1860s and 1870s, the Turkish bath maintained a small but devoted clientele, even as the number of traditional facilities declined. The influence of the Victorian Turkish bath lingered. Many of the techniques, the sequence of gradual heating, intense sweating, and cooling, found their way into modern spa culture. Health clubs, luxury hotels, and wellness centers often incorporated saunas or aromatic dry rooms that owed a clear debt to the 19th century bath movement. In architecture, the ornate interiors of surviving bathhouses inspired later designers of leisure spaces. The Moorish tiles, painted domes, and patterned screens became visual shorthand for luxury and escapism, appearing in cinemas, restaurants, and swimming pools built in the early 20th century. In popular memory, however, the Turkish bath retained a faintly comic air. Edwardian writers sometimes portrayed it as a place of eccentric characters and overheated conversations. The once revolutionary heat rooms had become, in the cultural imagination, slightly old-fashioned, a vestige of an earlier era's health obsessions. The Victorian Turkish bath did not vanish overnight. Instead, it slipped quietly into the background, replaced in many people's routines by quicker, more accessible forms of bathing. Indoor plumbing meant that hot baths at home were now possible for the middle classes, removing one of the main incentives for visiting a public facility. Yet even in its decline, the movement left behind a subtle but enduring contribution. It had changed how the British thought about bathing. Once purely functional, a rare and sometimes unpleasant necessity, bathing had become something that could be pleasurable, social, and restorative. That idea, imported with the heat and stone of the Turkish bath, would survive long after the last Victorian hot room cooled. From the sweltering chambers of London to the marble plunge pools of seaside resorts, the Turkish bath journey in Britain was one of adoption, adaptation, and eventual transformation. It began as a health crusade, blossomed into a fashionable ritual, and settled into history as a cultural curiosity. A reminder that even the most intense trends can cool with time. Imagine standing on a quiet stretch of North American plains in the early morning. The sun has not yet risen high enough to burn away the mist that clings to the earth. The air is cool, carrying the smell of damp soil, sagebrush, and smoke from a low fire. Nearby, a small domed structure rises from the ground, its frame bent from supple willow branches, its surface covered in hides or heavy blankets. This is a sweat lodge, a space that is at once physical shelter, spiritual chamber, and living connection to the earth. For countless generations, indigenous peoples across North America have used sweat lodges for purposes that go far beyond physical cleansing. These structures are places of prayer, of ceremony, of renewal, where heat and steam become tools for both the body and the spirit. To understand them fully, you must see them not only as buildings, but as expressions of a worldview in which health is inseparable from harmony with the land and community. The construction of a sweat lodge begins with the frame. Willow branches are preferred because they are strong yet flexible, capable of being bent into a dome without breaking. These are driven into the earth in a circular pattern, their tops tied together in a central knot that creates a rounded skeleton. The shape is not arbitrary. The dome is often seen as representing the womb of the earth, a place of rebirth and renewal. The frame is then covered with animal hides, heavy blankets, or, in more recent times, canvas tarps, anything that can hold in heat and block out the light. The goal is to create total darkness inside, broken only by the red glow of heated stones. The floor is bare earth, sometimes covered with sage or sweetgrass for scent and purification. A small pit is dug at the center, which will hold the heated stones. Outside, a fire burns steadily, heating a pile of selected rocks, often volcanic stones, chosen because they can withstand extreme temperatures without cracking. The stones are considered more than just tools. They are sometimes referred to as grandfathers or stone people, ancient beings that hold knowledge and life force from deep within the earth. The fire used to heat the stones is as much a part of the ceremony as the lodge itself. It is built with care, sometimes with prayers offered at each stage. For the people who will enter the lodge, for the health of the community, for the balance of the world. The firekeeper, often someone with experience and respect for the tradition, tends the flames until the stones glow red hot. This can take hours, depending on the size of the lodge and the number of participants. Once the stones are ready, they are carried, often using pitchforks or antler tongs, from the fire to the pit inside the lodge. The act of bringing them in is ceremonial, with each stone greeted by those inside, sometimes with a spoken phrase or song. Participants enter the sweat lodge in a specific manner, usually crouching low to pass through the small doorway. Shoes are left outside along with watches, jewelry, or anything that might distract from the experience. Inside, the air is warm but not yet stifling. Everyone sits in a circle around the central pit, facing one another in the dimness. Once everyone is inside, the door flap is lowered and darkness envelops the group. The only light comes from the stones, glowing faintly red in the pit. Water is then poured onto them, releasing a burst of steam that fills the enclosed space. The sudden heat is enveloping, pressing close against the skin, sinking into muscles, making the heartbeat quicken. Sweat lodge ceremonies often proceed in rounds, each with a specific purpose. In many traditions, there are 4 rounds, corresponding to the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, or stages of life. The first round might focus on giving thanks for life, for the earth, for the people gathered. Songs are sung, prayers spoken, sometimes in the indigenous language of the community. The air grows hotter with each ladle of water cast onto the stones. Here, sweat is not merely the body's reaction to heat, it is part of the cleansing. The heat draws out not only physical impurities but, in the belief of many traditions, spiritual burdens as well. Participants are encouraged to breathe deeply, to let the steam work on them, to let go of whatever weighs them down. From an outsider's perspective, it might be easy to focus solely on the physical effects, the profuse sweating, the accelerated pulse, the relief that comes after stepping back into cool air. But within the indigenous worldview, the sweat lodge is not simply about the body. It is a place to restore balance, to seek visions, to heal emotional wounds, and to connect with the creator or the spirit world. The lodge itself is considered alive, a sacred space in which all elements are present: earth in the floor, fire in the heated stones, water in the steam, and air in the breaths shared by those inside. Every detail, from the choice of rocks to the songs sung, carries meaning. In this way, the sweat lodge exists in 2 worlds at once. It is both a practical, heat-based cleansing space and a deeply symbolic, spiritual environment. It is an act of endurance, yes, but also one of humility, gratitude, and reconnection. And yet, for all the shared principles, no 2 lodges are exactly alike. Across North America, different nations and tribes have their own variations in structure, ceremony, and meaning. Why did these differences emerge? And how do they reflect the landscapes and histories of the people who built them? If you were to travel across the vast territories once, and still inhabited by Native American nations, you would encounter sweat lodges in many forms. The structure might be larger or smaller, the covering thicker or lighter, the ceremony longer or shorter. Each community shapes the practice to reflect its own climate, history, and spiritual teachings. Yet, despite these differences, certain principles are shared: respect for the lodge, the stones, the fire, and the people present. In the northern plains, where winters can be brutal, sweat lodges might be heavily insulated, their coverings layered with thick hides to trap the heat. Among the Lakota, for instance, the lodge is often low to the ground, forcing participants to crawl inside, emphasizing humility. In the southwest, where summers are blistering, lodges might use lighter coverings, and the ceremonies could take place in the early morning or late evening to avoid the worst of the heat. The Cree of the Canadian boreal forests sometimes use larger lodges, accommodating more participants for community-wide events. In contrast, smaller lodges might be used for intimate healing ceremonies involving only a few individuals. Some lodges are semi-permanent, maintained year-round, while others are built fresh for each event, then dismantled afterward. A reminder that sacred spaces need not be fixed in place to retain their power. While each tradition is unique, Many sweat lodge ceremonies are divided into 4 rounds. Between rounds, the door flap is lifted briefly to allow fresh stones to be brought in and to let some participants step outside if needed. Each round carries its own intention. First round, gratitude and opening. The lodge is dark, the first stones glow, and the steam rises in thick clouds. This round is for thanksgiving to the Creator, to the earth, to the ancestors, and to the participants themselves for taking part. Songs of welcome and gratitude are sung, and the air is filled with both heat and reverence. Second round, purification. Here, the focus shifts inward. Participants may silently or aloud release what burdens them: grief, anger, illness, fear. In some traditions, the leader sprinkles specific herbs like sage or cedar on the stones, filling the lodge with aromatic smoke, believed to help cleanse the spirit as the steam cleanses the body. Third round, prayer and healing. This is often the most intense. The heat is at its peak, and prayers are offered for specific people, events, or needs. Those who have come seeking healing for illness, recovery from loss, or guidance in times of uncertainty may speak or sit quietly while others pray for them. Fourth round, closing and renewal. The final round brings the ceremony toward completion. Prayers of closure and thanks are offered, and songs call for strength and balance as participants prepare to leave the lodge and re-enter the outside world. The physical reality of a sweat lodge can be demanding. The heat is humid and enveloping, seeping into the skin and lungs. Breathing can become deliberate, each inhalation pulling in air thick with steam and the scent of herbs. The darkness can feel disorienting, but it also sharpens other senses: the hiss of water hitting the stones, the rustle of bodies shifting in the circle, the sound of voices rising and falling in chant. As minutes pass, sweat beads on the skin, then runs freely, mingling with the earthy scent of the ground beneath. Heartbeats quicken and muscles loosen. Some participants describe a point at which the physical discomfort fades into something meditative, a sense of floating in heat and sound. Every sweat lodge needs a leader, often called the lodge keeper. This person is responsible for guiding the ceremony, maintaining safety, and ensuring that traditions are respected. They might be an elder, a healer, or someone trained for many years under a mentor. The lodge keeper decides when to open or close the door flap, how much water to pour on the stones, and when to move between rounds. The leader also ensures that the lodge remains a safe space for all participants. While the heat can be intense, the goal is not to test endurance to dangerous extremes, but to encourage physical release and spiritual openness. Those who feel overwhelmed are encouraged to step out between rounds without shame, returning when ready. Stepping out of the sweat lodge into fresh air can be a moment of deep relief. The cool breeze feels almost unreal against skin that has been pressed under heavy heat for so long. Eyes adjust to daylight, and the smells of earth, smoke, and foliage return with clarity. Some traditions encourage participants to drink water immediately, replenishing what has been lost through sweating. Others may end with a communal meal, a reminder that healing and community go hand in hand. The sweat lodge is not meant to be an isolated experience, forgotten once the stones have cooled. For many, the effects linger: a sense of clarity, a lighter spirit, a renewed connection to the land and the people around them. The physical benefits, such as improved circulation and muscle relaxation, are accompanied by the less visible but equally important emotional and spiritual effects. And yet, the sweat lodge is not without its challenges. Heat can be taxing, and ceremonies must be approached with respect for both tradition and personal limits. Leaders are keenly aware that this practice, while powerful, demands careful preparation and responsibility. Still, the question remains: how did such a physically intense ritual come to hold such enduring cultural and spiritual significance across so many Native American nations? The sweat lodge, as an institution, is a paradox of permanence and change. For countless generations, it has served as a place of renewal, a center for spiritual alignment, and a setting for communal healing. Yet it has also adapted, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, in response to historical pressures, environmental realities, and the changing needs of communities. When European colonists arrived in North America, many native traditions faced suppression. Ceremonial practices were often misunderstood, labeled as superstitious or dangerous, and in some regions were outright banned under federal policies. The sweat lodge, with its blend of physical intensity and spiritual purpose, was particularly vulnerable to such misunderstanding. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, US and Canadian government policies actively discouraged or prohibited indigenous ceremonies, including sweat lodges. Some leaders carried out the rituals in secrecy, often in remote locations, passing down the knowledge quietly to apprentices and family members. In some communities, decades passed with only whispered mentions of the practice. This persistence, despite risk, speaks to the deep-rooted value of the sweat lodge in native cultures. For many, it was not simply a health treatment or a form of social gathering. It was a lifeline to identity, history, and spirituality. The late 20th century saw a revival of interest in traditional native practices. Legislative changes, such as the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 in the United States, began to protect ceremonial practices that had long been suppressed. Elders emerged to teach the younger generations, and lodges were rebuilt in open spaces rather than hidden groves. Today, sweat lodges are held across North America, from reservations and reserves to cultural centers and powwow grounds. Some ceremonies are strictly for members of a particular tribe, while others welcome non-native guests, provided they approach with respect and follow the guidance of experienced leaders. In modern times, sweat lodges serve multiple functions. They remain deeply spiritual for many Native Americans, but they also offer therapeutic benefits, recognized in wider wellness circles, stress relief, detoxification, and mental clarity. Still, leaders emphasize that the physical benefits are secondary. The heart of the sweat lodge lies in its teachings and community bonds. In the sweat lodge, time feels both suspended and accelerated. Minutes can stretch endlessly during the most intense heat, yet the ceremony as a whole can pass in what feels like a blink. Participants often emerge with the same quiet astonishment. The world outside is the same, but they themselves feel different. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson, that the world will always carry its burdens, but we can choose to carry them differently. We can pause, breathe, and emerge renewed, even if the challenges ahead remain unchanged. The question lingers in an age of rapid change, digital distraction, and constant noise. Could the slow, deliberate, and humbling space of the sweat lodge be exactly the kind of refuge we have forgotten how to seek? Steam curls upward from a pool tucked among snow-covered rocks. The sound of trickling water blends with the distant calls of mountain birds. Somewhere deep below, volcanic heat forces mineral-rich water toward the surface, emerging into an open air bath, an onsen. You step forward, the air crisp against your skin, and lower yourself slowly into the heat. The sensation is immediate and all-encompassing, a gentle ache melting into pure relief. This is not simply a bath. This is a tradition older than many nations. Japan sits atop the so-called Ring of Fire, a seismically active belt that rings the Pacific Ocean. Beneath its islands, geothermal energy is constantly at work, heating subterranean waters and infusing them with minerals. The country boasts thousands of natural hot springs, each with a unique mineral composition: sulfur, sodium, magnesium, or iron, giving them distinct colors, scents, and reputed healing properties. The earliest records of hot spring bathing in Japan date back more than 1,000 years, but archaeological evidence suggests the practice is far older. Fragments of tools and simple wooden bathing structures hint that people were using geothermal waters long before written history. Early Japanese society, like many cultures, valued the therapeutic effects of soaking, but here, bathing also took on spiritual and communal importance. One of the oldest written mentions of onsens appears in the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, compiled in the 8th century. In its pages, certain springs are described as miraculous places of healing, visited by emperors, priests, and warriors. The Izu, Beppu, and Dogo onsens were celebrated destinations even then, believed to cure ailments ranging from arthritis to skin conditions. Some onsens became pilgrimage sites. People would travel for days, even weeks, to reach a particularly famous spring, often as part of a larger spiritual journey. Bathing in these waters was not merely for cleanliness. It was an act of purification, preparing body and spirit for prayer or meditation. The blending of bathing with religion in Japan was inevitable. Shinto, the indigenous spiritual tradition, places great emphasis on purification misogi. While misogi often refers to ritual washing in cold rivers or under waterfalls, hot springs were also viewed as sacred. They were gifts from the kami, divine spirits, residing in nature. With the introduction of Buddhism from China and Korea in the 6th century, the contemplative and health-related aspects of bathing gained even more cultural weight. Buddhist temples sometimes maintain baths for monks and travelers, emphasizing not only spiritual cleanliness, but also physical well-being. Over time, towns grew around certain temples and their hot springs, laying the groundwork for Japan's famous onsen resorts. In the centuries before modern plumbing, a hot spring was often the center of social life in rural Japan. Villagers would gather at the onsen, not just to bathe but to share news, discuss harvests, arrange marriages, or settle disputes. The bath was a social equalizer. Farmers and nobles could soak in the same waters, wearing the same simple cotton towels, stripped of titles and daily concerns. These communal gatherings also served a practical purpose. Bathing in hot mineral water reduced the spread of skin conditions and provided warmth in harsh winters. For isolated mountain villages, a onsen could be the difference between enduring the cold season and succumbing to its dangers. Despite centuries of change, the basic onsen experience has remained remarkably consistent. One begins with a thorough wash outside the bath, a practice rooted in both Shinto purification and common courtesy. Only after cleansing does one enter the steaming water, easing in slowly to avoid dizziness. Silence or soft conversation is the norm, allowing bathers to relax without disruption. The mineral scent, the rising steam, and the sound of water have always combined to create an atmosphere of tranquility. Whether a visitor came to heal an aching body, purify the spirit, or meet with friends, the result was the same: a sense of renewal. The history of onsen is as much about the people as it is about the springs themselves. But how did these humble pools of geothermal water transform into one of Japan's most enduring cultural symbols, attracting travelers from every corner of the nation? Steam still rises from the pools, but now the surrounding landscape is not untouched wilderness. It's dotted with wooden inns, lantern-lit walkways, and the faint scent of grilled fish drifting from open windows. The Japanese onsen, once the preserve of rural communities and pilgrims, was about to step onto a larger stage. During the Sengoku period, 15th-17th centuries, Japan was racked by almost constant warfare. Samurai, traveling between campaigns, often stopped at hot springs to recover from battle injuries. Certain onsens became famous as healing retreats for warriors, earning reputations that persist to this day. The springs at Kusatsu, for example, were believed to purify wounds and strengthen the body. Samurai lords sometimes built small lodgings beside these baths for their retainers, ensuring soldiers could recover quickly. Over time, inns as a ryokan began to cater to travelers of all kinds, offering simple rooms, rice meals, and access to the baths. Interestingly, some onsens served as neutral meeting grounds. The shared act of bathing, in which armor and weapons were left outside, created a rare space where rival clans could talk without immediate fear of treachery. Though not common, these occasions were remembered in local lore as moments when hot water eased not only aching muscles, but also political tensions, at least for a time. By the Edo period, 603-1868, Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, and relative peace allowed travel to flourish. This era saw a dramatic expansion in domestic tourism. Pilgrimage routes to famous shrines and temples often included stops at well-known hot springs. Illustrated guidebooks detailed the mineral content of each spring, the best seasons to visit, and the types of ailments each could supposedly cure. Some onsens became so popular that entire towns sprang up around them, complete with entertainment districts, bathhouses, and artisan shops selling lacquerware or textiles to visitors. The baths themselves were increasingly formalized, with gender-separated facilities becoming common in larger establishments. Onsens also inspired creativity. Haiku poets, ukiyo-e woodblock artists, and travel diarists captured scenes of steam rising against snowy mountains, or weary travelers lowering themselves into the water after a day's journey. These images reinforced the idea of the onsen as an essential part of Japanese life, not just for cleanliness or health, but for leisure, contemplation. The Meiji Restoration, 1868-1912, opened Japan to Western influence, and the onsen culture adapted. Modern plumbing and filtration systems were introduced to some facilities, while others retained their rustic charm. Western visitors marveled at the communal nature of bathing and the strict etiquette surrounding it, often remarking on the serene atmosphere, despite the bustle of activity. In some cases, onsens became part of official health programs, endorsed by doctors for their mineral benefits. Military hospitals even incorporated therapeutic baths for rehabilitation. By the early 20th century, onsen towns began marketing themselves as health resorts. In a way similar to European spa towns, brochures and posters promised relief from ailments ranging from rheumatism to digestive troubles. This was also the era when trains made remote springs accessible to urban populations, leading to a tourism boom. Despite modernization, many towns preserved ancient customs. Bathing naked remained the norm, as did the practice of washing thoroughly before entering. The water, often too hot for newcomers, was never cooled artificially. Instead, bathers were encouraged to ease themselves in slowly, respecting the natural temperature set by the earth. The Second World War disrupted tourism, and many onsens fell into disrepair. However, in the post-war economic boom, travel returned in force. Companies organized employee retreats to hot springs, and families once again took seasonal trips to the mountains or coast to soak. The 1960s and 70s saw a surge in urban stress, and onsens were marketed not just as health treatments, but as antidotes to modern life. Television dramas and travel shows featured iconic onsen towns, further boosting their appeal. By the late 20th century, the onsen had become both a cherished national tradition and an internationally recognized symbol of Japan. But how did the experience itself, the quiet rituals, the mineral waters, the connection to nature, maintain its power across centuries of change? Steam curls into the cool evening air. The scent of mineral, rich water mingles with the faint aroma of cedar wood from the bathhouse walls. The sound of a distant river blends with the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the rafters. Whether you are a farmer from a nearby village 200 years ago, or a business traveler from Tokyo today, this is the moment where the outside world begins to fade. The modern onsen visit begins with etiquette. A chain of small, deliberate actions. Shoes are removed at the entrance. Guests change into yukata, light cotton robes provided by the inn, and slip into wooden sandals before walking to the bathhouse. Inside, there is no rushing. One undresses in the changing room and places clothes in baskets or lockers. The next stop is the washing area, where each bather sits on a small stool, scrubs with soap, and rinses thoroughly. Only after this cleansing does one enter the hot water, ensuring it remains pure for everyone. This process may seem procedural, but it has a calming effect. Each step slows the mind, preparing it for immersion. Japan's volcanic geology produces a wide spectrum of mineral waters. Sulfur springs, with their egg-like smell, are prized for skin conditions. Ion-rich waters have a reddish hue and are thought to boost circulation. Carbonated springs produce tiny bubbles that cling to the skin, while milky, white waters from volcanic rock are valued for their silky texture. Each mineral profile is associated with specific therapeutic claims, many of which have been passed down through centuries of observation rather than formal scientific study. While indoor baths offer shelter and privacy, the Rotenboro, outdoor baths, are considered the pinnacle of onsen experience. Sitting in steaming water under a snowfall, or in the midst of autumn leaves, creates a contrast that heightens the senses. Some outdoor baths are beside rivers, allowing bathers to hear rushing water, while others are perched on cliff edges with sweeping views of the sea. Historically, mixed-gender bathing konioku was common, especially in rural areas. Over the 20th century, gender-separated baths became standard, partly due to Western influence and shifting social norms. Today, mixed bathing still exists but is rare, often requiring swimsuits or private reservations. tourism has brought new challenges. Some onsen towns have faced strain from over-visitation, while others struggle to balance traditional customs with the expectations of international guests, unfamiliar with the rules. Still, many establishments have found ways to welcome outsiders without diluting the cultural experience. In a country known for long work hours and dense urban living, onsens remain a vital counterbalance. They are places where phones are set aside, conversations slow, and time is measured not in minutes, but in the gradual softening of muscles and the deepening of breath. Even in major cities, supercento large public bath complexes recreate elements of the onsen, offering multiple pools, saunas, and relaxation spaces. While these may lack the mountain air or volcanic origins, they preserve the spirit of the practice. Communal, cleansing, and quietly restorative. The culture export of the onsen has reached far beyond Japanese shores. From luxury resorts in Europe to spa towns in Taiwan, the influence is visible. Some even import Japanese volcanic minerals to replicate the bathing experience abroad. Yet, the true onsen, with its combination of natural setting, centuries-old customs, and unspoken etiquette, remains deeply tied to the Japanese landscape. The enduring appeal of onsens may lie in their paradox. They are simultaneously ancient and adaptable. They survive by remaining rooted in slow, deliberate ritual, yet they adjust to new technologies, shifting social norms, and modern tourism. In this way, the hot spring is more than just water. It is a living link between past and present, a constant in a country that has otherwise transformed many times over. And so, as the steam rises into the night, and the water laps quietly against the rock, you might wonder, in a future of ever faster lifestyles and virtual experiences, will there always be a place for the slow, physical ritual of lowering oneself into a pool of volcanic water? If you were to stroll through a quiet German spa town in the early 19th century, you might hear the slow creak of wicker bath chairs rolling along a shaded promenade. Ladies in broad-brimmed hats and men in tailored coats would be walking deliberately, sipping from porcelain cups filled with warm, mineral-rich water that smelled faintly of iron or sulfur. This was not a leisure trip in the modern sense. This was cure, a prescribed health treatment, equal parts medical regimen and social ritual. Germany's spa tradition stretches back to Roman times, when garrisons and merchants settled near warm mineral springs. The Romans called them aquae and built bathhouses to harness the water's warmth and minerals for health. Many modern spa towns, Baden, Wiesbaden, Aachen, still occupy the same sites the Romans once used. During the Middle Ages, these towns were known for their healing wells, though bathing itself had fallen out of favor in much of Europe. Instead, people would drink the waters, sometimes in large quantities, believing that the minerals could flush illness from the body. By the 16th century, physicians began prescribing specific spa visits, noting that certain springs seemed better for digestive complaints, others for joint pain, and others still for skin conditions. The Kurhaus, literally cure house, emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as a central building in spa towns. These were not purely medical facilities, nor were they mere resorts. They were hybrids, places to take the waters, receive therapies, stroll, and socialize. The architecture reflected their status, often featuring grand columns, ballrooms, reading rooms, and wide terraces where guests could take in fresh air between treatments. Unlike the private bathing of an onsen, or the structured public baths of ancient Rome, the kurhaus placed equal weight on social life. A kur was as much about being seen as it was about healing. Guests mingled in gardens, attended concerts, and played games in elegant salons. Health was pursued in a context of culture, manners, and display. Each spa town guarded the uniqueness of its springs. The mineral content, measured and analyzed by physicians, was published in guides so that patients could choose the right location for their condition. Saline waters, high in sodium chloride, were said to improve circulation and aid recovery from respiratory illness. Sulfur springs were recommended for skin ailments and arthritis, despite their pungent odor. Iron-rich waters were taken for anemia and fatigue, turning the cups they touched a reddish hue over time. Carbonated springs, naturally sparkling, were praised for digestive issues. The experience of taking the waters was itself a slow, measured process. Guests would sip small amounts several times a day while walking gently along a designated path, the tranquil allowing the combination of water and movement to work together. In the 19th century, the spa regimen was highly structured under medical supervision. Upon arrival, guests visited the Kurast spa doctor, who prescribed a program: how much water to drink, how often to bathe, what kinds of exercise to take, even dietary adjustments. A typical morning might involve an early walk to the spring, drinking a cup of mineral water, a slow promenade under covered colonnades, a light breakfast, and perhaps a mineral bath or inhalation therapy later in the day. Patients were expected to follow this program for weeks, sometimes months. A cure was not a quick escape, it was a deliberate, extended intervention, often covered in part by public health systems in later years. By the mid-1800s, the German spa circuit became a fashionable seasonal destination for Europe's upper classes. Aristocrats, industrial magnates, and cultural figures like Goethe and Dostoevsky spent time in spa towns, blending medical treatment with leisure. The Kurast ballroom might host waltzes in the evening, while afternoons were filled with quiet reading in a sunlit salon. The presence of such figures turned certain towns into hubs of diplomacy and art. Business deals were struck between promenades, literary works were drafted in spa cafes, and political negotiations took place far from formal chambers, eased along by the civility of the Kurast environment. While early spa treatments were grounded in the belief in mineral water's curative properties, the Kurast also promoted a broader idea of health, one that included rest, mild physical activity, exposure to fresh air, and relief from urban stress. This holistic approach was unusual for the time, when medicine often relied on drastic interventions like bloodletting or purgatives. Still, questions lingered. Were the benefits due to the minerals themselves, or to the slower pace of life, the improved diet, and the absence of industrial smoke? Even then, doctors debated whether the cure was medicine or simply a well-orchestrated rest cure. And so, in the quiet colonnades of a German spa town, as the clink of porcelain cups echoed softly, and the scent of sulphur drifted on the air, one might wonder, was it truly the water that healed, or the entire world carefully built around it? If you were to spend a day in a German spa town during the height of the Kurast era in the 19th century, you would quickly realize that every hour had its place, and every activity had its purpose. Unlike a modern holiday where one might sleep late, rush to catch sightseeing tours, or lounge idly, the Kur experience was a carefully paced sequence of healthful tasks. It was as much a discipline as it was a pleasure. The day began early. By 6 or 7 in the morning, the town's tranquil, a long, colonnaded pavilion, was already filling with people. They would collect their porcelain trinkbecher, drinking cup, each stamped with the name of the spa town, and join the slow, moving procession along the arcade. Each sip of the mineral water was followed by a measured number of steps. This was not about thirst. The doctor's orders specified exact amounts, often 1 cup every 20 minutes, over the course of an hour or more. The pace was slow, the conversation polite, and the atmosphere hushed. The idea was to let the water work, without taxing the body with anything vigorous. Some springs were outdoors, steam rising from them in the cool morning air. Others were tapped into ornate indoor fountains, decorated with carvings and mosaics. The scent could be sharp, sulphurous, metallic, or briny. But to the faithful, this was the smell of health. After the promenade, guests dispersed to the various treatment wings of the Kurhaus, or to private bathhouses nearby. The menu of therapies was long mineral baths, in large marble tubs, the water heated or cooled depending on the prescription. Mud baths, where mineral-rich silt from nearby sources was applied to the body, said to draw out impurities and ease joint pain. Inhalation rooms, where steam infused with mineral vapors or pine essences was breathed in to help with respiratory conditions. Carbonic acid baths, a peculiar bubbling soak in naturally carbonated water, believed to stimulate circulation. Each session was strictly timed and followed by rest. The Kur philosophy valued moderation over exertion, even in pursuit of health, was considered counterproductive. The middle of the day was devoted to relaxation, light meals, and perhaps a quiet carriage ride through the surrounding countryside. Many spa towns were nestled in valleys or on wooded hillsides, and part of the therapeutic program was exposure to clean, unpolluted air. Reading rooms in the Kurhaus offered newspapers from across Europe, small lending libraries, and even occasional lectures on health or science. Music was omnipresent. A small orchestra might play in the gardens as guests took coffee, the soft strains of waltzes or marches drifting between flower beds. By evening, the more social aspect of the Kurhaus came alive. Dining rooms glowed with candlelight, and guests dined at communal tables. Another form of therapy, at least for the lonely or stressed urban dweller. The menus were light by modern standards, often featuring local fish, boiled vegetables, and the ever-present mineral water. After dinner came the highlight of the day, the Kurhaus ballroom or concert hall. Dance was encouraged in moderation, though the emphasis was on elegance rather than exertion. For those less inclined to movement, the gaming rooms offered card tables, chess boards, and in some towns, roulette wheels, a subtle reminder that wellness and leisure could share the same roof. Central to all this was the Kurhaus. These spa doctors held an unusual position, part physician, part director of daily life. They were quick to adjust regimens based on patient response, advising on everything from posture during walking to the number of layers one should wear during the morning promenade. Some were innovators, experimenting with new therapies such as electrotherapy baths or the use of ozone in inhalation rooms. Others were conservative, holding fast to traditional water cures and warning against modern medical interventions. A few became famous in their own right, attracting patients from across the continent. While the medical benefits of the cure were debated, there was little argument that it created a distinctive cultural environment. The Kurhaus was not just a building, it was a stage upon which a certain vision of life played out, orderly, refined, and in harmony with nature's rhythms. But questions persisted. Was this truly accessible healthcare, or a luxury for those who could afford to spend weeks away from work? By the late 19th century, industrialization had widened the gap between those who could attend the cure and those who toiled in the cities. Even as state health insurance programs began to cover certain spa treatments, the social dimension of the Kurhaus remained firmly tied to a more privileged world, and so, as guests in evening finery drifted out of the ballroom and back to their lodgings, the lantern-lit promenades still echoed with the question: was the Kurhaus more about healing the body, or about creating an ordered vision of how life should be lived? The golden age of the German Kurhaus, roughly spanning from the mid-19th century to the eve of the First World War, was shaped by a delicate balance of medicine, leisure, and social theatre. But history is rarely kind to institutions that rely so heavily on both fashion and prosperity. By the 20th century, the currents that had once carried the Kurhaus to prominence began to shift. The First World War shattered Europe's comfortable patterns of seasonal travel. Wealthy spa visitors from Britain, France, and Russia no longer crossed borders so freely. Many spa towns found themselves cut off from their international clientele, their elegant promenades now eerily empty. Even when peace returned, it was a different kind of peace, one in which rail and steamship travel opened new destinations far beyond Europe. The Mediterranean coast, the Alps for skiing, even journeys to North Africa or the United States became fashionable alternatives. The slow, orderly rhythm of the cure felt increasingly old-fashioned to the restless interwar traveller. Medicine, too, was moving in new directions. The late 19th century had already introduced laboratory science, germ theory, and a more skeptical view of natural cures. While many physicians still prescribed spa treatments, these were increasingly seen as complementary rather than primary therapies. Certain mineral waters continued to have recognized benefits, especially for digestive disorders or skin conditions, but the belief that the cure could treat everything from melancholy to gout began to wane. Hospitals and clinics, with their modern equipment and research laboratories, drew attention away from the spa's colonnades. Yet the Kurhaus did not vanish. In Germany, the tradition proved surprisingly adaptable. During the Weimar Republic and even under Nazi rule, spa treatments were incorporated into state health programs. Workers could receive subsidized trips to certain spas, reframing the cure as a form of preventive healthcare rather than aristocratic indulgence. After the Second World War, both East and West Germany continued this policy in their own ways. In the East, spa towns were integrated into socialist health planning. In the West, health insurance programs often covered prescribed spa visits, ensuring that the tradition survived even in an age of antibiotics and modern surgery. By the late 20th century, many cure users had shifted their focus. Some became hotels, conference centers, or event venues, preserving the architecture and gardens, but replacing the medical core with hospitality services. Others remained firmly within the wellness industry, now blending traditional mineral water therapies with newer trends such as aromatherapy, physiotherapy, and saunas. Tourists visiting a kurhaus today will find much of the 19th century elegance: intact grand staircases, frescoed ceilings, flower-filled promenades, and perhaps a string quartet in the afternoons. But the clientele is different: retirees on insurance, covered cure programs, conference attendees, or weekend visitors in search of relaxation rather than a prescribed medical regimen. If the kurhaus has a legacy, it lies in its insistence on structure. In an age before modern medicine could offer quick fixes, these spa towns built entire communities around the idea that healing required time, patience, and a carefully ordered environment. The daily rhythm, walk, drink, rest, converse, may seem quaint now, but it was a conscious rejection of the disorder and stress of industrial life. The kurhaus taught that recovery was not just about the body, but about the setting in which the body was placed. And so, as the sun sets over the colonnades of Baden, Wiesbaden, or Bad Kissingen, the mineral fountains still bubble as they did 2 centuries ago. Guests still stroll in slow procession, porcelain cups in hand, even if their doctors no longer promise miraculous cures. The question lingers: was the true benefit of the kurhaus found in the minerals of its waters, or in the disciplined, unhurried life it allowed people to live, if only for a few weeks each year? If you were a fashionable European in the 19th century with a troublesome liver, stiff joints, or a vague sense of being run down, you might have found yourself not in a doctor's clinic, but up to your neck in warm, dark mud. To the modern eye, this might seem like an eccentric holiday activity, something one might try at a seaside spa for novelty's sake. But to the 19th century health seeker, the mud bath, Schlammbad in German, Fangi in Italian, or simply peat cure in English medical parlance, was a serious, prescribed therapy, administered in grand resorts under the watchful eyes of physicians. The belief in the healing powers of mud has ancient roots. The Romans were already familiar with volcanic and mineral-rich mud, particularly in places like Ischia and the volcanic fields near Naples. Pliny the Elder wrote of therapeutic clays, and Roman bath complexes often incorporated natural thermal mud. But the 19th century gave the mud cure new life. This was partly due to a larger trend, the water cure movement, which swept across Europe in the early 1800s. If mineral waters could be drunk or bathed in for health, so the reasoning went, perhaps they could also be applied in thicker, warmer, and more enveloping forms. Mud for health resorts was not just any garden soil. It was typically peat or clay mixed with mineral, rich thermal water. The most famous European sources included Abonno Terme and Montegrotto Terme, Italy, volcanic mud enriched by hot springs flowing beneath the Euganean hills. Franzensbad and Marienbad, Bohemius, now Czech Republic, peat mud from surrounding marshlands, blended with mineral waters high in carbonic acid. Bad Nendorf, Germany, sulfur-rich mud, notorious for its pungent smell, but prized for rheumatism relief. Dead Sea settlements, though not a 19th century invention, their mineral-laden black mud began attracting European visitors in this period. In many resorts, the mud was stored for weeks or months in special curing pits. During this time, it absorbed minerals from the hot springs, developed its characteristic texture, and, in the opinion of spa doctors, increased in potency. The ritual of the mud bath in the 19th century was surprisingly formal. A patient would arrive at the spa clinic in the morning, possibly after drinking a prescribed amount of mineral water to prime the body. They would then be led to a private bathing room or a larger communal hall. The attendant, often a strong-armed bath servant, would help the bather into a large wooden tub or stone basin filled with warm mud, sometimes heated to 44.5 degrees C, 104-117 degrees F. The mud's density meant that the bather floated with ease, the thick mass pressing evenly on all sides. This pressure was thought to improve circulation, reduce inflammation, and ease muscle tension. In some cases, instead of full immersion, the mud would be applied as a poultice or packed to specific joints, wrapped in linen, and left for up to an hour. This was particularly common for those with gout, arthritis, or injuries. In the 19th century, medical explanations for the mud cure blended old humoral theories with emerging physiology. Spa doctors argued that the heat of the mud dilated blood vessels, promoting the removal of morbid matter from the body. Others believed the minerals penetrated the skin directly, supplementing the blood with trace elements. There was also the idea of sweating out illness. Enclosed in the warm mud, a patient would perspire heavily. This sweating was interpreted as the body expelling toxins, an appealingly simple explanation that made intuitive sense to many visitors, even if modern science would later complicate the picture. Though rooted in medicine, the mud bath also became a social ritual. In certain resorts, especially in Italy and Bohemia, wealthy visitors might schedule their mud sessions close together, so they could exchange conversation while reclining in separate tubs. Others preferred more private treatments, emerging afterward to stroll the spa gardens, wrapped in loose gowns, faces flushed from the heat. The great kurhauses of Europe often had entire wings devoted to mud therapy, complete with tiled corridors, attendants in uniform, and dressing rooms lined with polished wood lockers. The seriousness of the setting reinforced the sense that this was not mere indulgence, but legitimate medicine. By the mid-19th century, mud baths had moved from a regional curiosity to a pan-European health fashion. Spa towns expanded their facilities, competing for the best mud sources, the most elegant bathing halls, and the most persuasive medical endorsements. Yet as the century progressed, new questions arose. Was the benefit truly from the minerals in the mud, or simply from the heat and rest it enforced? And could such an ancient remedy survive in an era of rapidly advancing modern medicine? By the second half of the 19th century, the mud bath had fully entered Europe's health economy. Spa towns published elegant brochures promising miraculous recoveries. Railway companies offered discounted tickets to invalid travelers, and physicians issued referrals as readily as prescriptions. But with popularity came both refinement and controversy. The role of the spa physician was central to the experience. Visitors arriving for their cure would begin with a consultation in the physician's office, often a paneled room lined with anatomical charts, mineral samples, and testimonials from grateful former patients. The doctor would examine the patient's medical history, constitution, and symptoms, then prescribe a course of treatment. For some, this meant daily full body mud baths for 3 weeks. For others, a gentler approach with alternate days, partial applications, and plenty of rest in between. Patients might also be advised to drink specific mineral waters in precise quantities, take early morning walks, or avoid certain foods entirely. A well-trained spa doctor did more than dispense mud. He managed the entire rhythm of the guest's stay, and in the world of competitive spa culture, his reputation could make or break a resort's appeal. Not all mud was created equal, or so the marketing claimed. Resorts promoted their particular blend with the zeal of modern branding. In the Austrian Empire, Franzensbad advertised its female-specific benefits, claiming its peat mud regulated menstruation and aided fertility. Bad Nendorf insisted its sulfur-rich mud had unmatched potency against chronic rheumatism. Italian spas like Abono Terme highlighted the volcanic origins of their fango, pointing to the heat, retaining qualities of their clay. The rivalry extended beyond advertisements. Resorts sometimes sent samples of their mud to universities for chemical analysis, hoping to publish scientific proof of superiority. These studies measured mineral content, pH levels, and organic matter, often yielding results that confirmed at least to spa goers, that their favorite resort's mud was indeed the most curative. As laboratory science advanced, the 19th century's medical establishment began to question spa therapies in general. Could minerals in mud really pass through the skin into the bloodstream? Was the supposed detoxification simply dehydration from sweating? Were patients improving because of the mud, or because they were resting, eating well, and escaping the stress of daily life? Not all doctors were believers. Some physicians, especially in urban hospitals, dismissed mud cures as fashionable indulgence for the wealthy. Others accused spa towns of exploiting desperate patients with exaggerated claims. Yet even among skeptics, there was a grudging acknowledgement that mud baths offered genuine relief for certain conditions, particularly those involving chronic pain. The warmth of the mud relaxed muscles, eased joint stiffness, and improved mobility, benefits that could be measured even if the underlying mechanism was debated. To the patient, the debate mattered less than the experience. A typical treatment might begin with an attendant helping the bather into a private chamber. The tub, often made of stone or heavy porcelain, was filled with steaming mud. Its surface glistened dark brown or nearly black, with a faint earthy scent. Once immersed, the patient would feel the dense, almost buoyant support of the mud. The warmth seeped in gradually, wrapping joints and muscles in steady heat. A sense of heaviness took over, but in a way that encouraged stillness and relaxation. After 20 to 30 minutes, the patient was helped out of the tub, a slippery business, and guided to a warm shower or a rinsing pool to remove the clinging mud. Then came the resting phase wrapped in blankets. The bather reclined in a quiet room, sweating gently for another half-hour while sipping mineral water or weak tea. This, after sweat, was considered as important as the bath itself. Railways transformed the mud bath from an elite pursuit to something within reach of the growing middle class. By the 1870s, clerks, school teachers, and shopkeepers were booking too, weak cures alongside aristocrats and foreign dignitaries. Spa towns expanded lodging options, adding modest boarding houses alongside grand hotels. This democratization of spa culture changed the social atmosphere. The exclusive corridors of the kurhaus now echoed with regional dialects, family chatter, and children playing in the gardens. Some long-standing elite patrons complained of overcrowding and the loss of refined quiet, but for many spa towns, the influx of a broader clientele meant steady business and a more vibrant atmosphere. By the close of the century, mud baths had settled into a comfortable paradox. They were both a medical treatment and a leisure activity, both subject to scientific criticism and buoyed by patient devotion. Still, a lingering question haunted the spa world: could this centuries-old therapy survive the coming age of laboratory medicine, antiseptics, and industrial pharmaceuticals? By the dawn of the 20th century, the cultural standing of mud baths faced a crossroads. For decades, they had been an integral part of spa culture, prescribed by doctors, embraced by the public, and wrapped in a mystique of ancient healing. But the medical world was changing rapidly, and what had once been considered cutting-edge therapy was now competing with laboratory-tested drugs and hospital-based treatments. The early 1900s saw the rise of bacteriology, germ theory, and more standardized medical practice. Penicillin was still decades away, but vaccines, antiseptics, and surgical improvements were already reshaping the landscape of healthcare. Many in the medical establishment began to see spa treatments as outdated, pleasant enough, perhaps, but scientifically unnecessary. Medical journals published critiques of mud therapy, pointing out the lack of rigorous clinical trials and accusing spa towns of leaning on anecdotal cures rather than measurable evidence. For spa towns dependent on medical tourism, such skepticism was no small matter. Yet it wasn't only science that posed a challenge. Geopolitics would deal an even heavier blow. World War I disrupted Europe's entire spa economy. Foreign visitors, who had once traveled long distances for summer cures, stayed home as borders closed and transport systems were redirected for military purposes. Some spa resorts were converted into military hospitals, their elegant bathing pavilions turned into wards for wounded soldiers. In a strange twist, mud baths were sometimes used for physical rehabilitation, particularly for injured limbs, keeping the therapy alive, but stripped of its glamorous resort image. After the war, many spa towns struggled to recover. Wealthy clients had lost fortunes, middle-class tourism slowed, and some of the most luxurious facilities fell into disrepair. Mud baths, while still practiced, no longer commanded the same unquestioned prestige. To survive, spa towns had to adapt. Marketing shifted from romantic elegance to functional health. Brochures now featured, before and after, diagrams of patients' posture or mobility, and treatments were described in quasi-scientific terms. Thermo-mineral applications, peat-based boniotherapy, organic sediment therapy. New clientele emerged: veterans with chronic pain, industrial workers with repetitive strain injuries, and the elderly seeking relief from arthritis. Spa physicians emphasized measurable outcomes such as improved range of motion or reduced swelling, framing mud therapy as a complement to, rather than a replacement for, hospital medicine. Some resorts even introduced modernized mud baths, filtered and sterilized mud, precise temperature control, and electric heating systems replacing traditional fire, stone methods. These innovations reassured the public about hygiene and safety, even if they altered the ritual's rustic charm. By the mid-1900s, mud baths had largely moved from being a purely medical cure to part of a broader wellness culture. In Western Europe and North America, spa-going became associated with beauty treatments, relaxation, and preventative care rather than recovery from illness. Resorts in Italy, Hungary, and Germany kept the tradition alive, though with modern architecture and a focus on comfort. Promotional materials now emphasized stress relief, skin improvement, and detoxification, a word that would have been foreign to the 19th century medical lexicon, but fit neatly into post-war leisure marketing. International travel also brought new influences. Tourists returning from Asia and the Middle East introduced ideas about herbal treatments, sauna culture, and alternative medicine, which merged with Europe's mud therapy traditions. The mud bath thus found a niche in the growing spa and wellness market, even as its strictly medical role diminished. Today, the 19th century style of mud bath still exists, often in historic spa towns where original facilities have been restored for heritage tourism. In places like Chaves in Hungary or Abano Terme in Italy, you can still sink into dense, mineral-rich mud in buildings that once hosted dukes, diplomats, and 19th century novelists. While modern medicine rarely prescribes mud therapy as a primary treatment, physiotherapists and alternative practitioners continue to recommend it for certain chronic conditions. Scientific studies have found limited but measurable benefits for arthritis, muscle stiffness, and skin conditions. And beyond any clinical proof, the sensory experience, the warmth, the weight, the slow rhythm of the treatment remains a draw for those seeking an escape from the speed of modern life. In the end, the story of the 19th century mud bath is less about the fate of a medical treatment and more about the endurance of a ritual. Even when stripped of its Victorian medical authority, the mud bath survived by adapting, sometimes as rehabilitation, sometimes as beauty care, sometimes as pure indulgence. The 19th century belief in the curative power of earth and water may no longer command unquestioned faith, but the act itself, of sinking into a warm, heavy silence, continues to speak to something timeless: the human desire to be still, to be soothed, and, for a moment, to let the world fall away. If you close your eyes and imagine Iceland, you might picture vast black lava fields, snow-capped mountains, and steam rising in thin white plumes from the ground. This is a country born of volcanoes and sculpted by glaciers, a place where the Earth's crust is so thin that boiling water bubbles up from deep underground in 1,000 different places. For Icelanders, these hot springs have never been a novelty. They have been part of daily life for more than a millennium. To understand Iceland's hot springs, you have to understand the land itself. The island straddles the mid-Atlantic ridge, a seam in the Earth's crust where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates slowly drift apart. Magma, never far from the surface, heats groundwater until it boils. The result is a landscape where scalding pools, steaming rivulets, and gushing geysers are simply part of the scenery. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland around the late 9th century, they came from lands where bathing was already a cultural habit. In Scandinavia, warm baths were seen as both practical and social, but Iceland offered something unique: natural hot water, ready to use, without the need to chop wood for heating. The earliest records of Icelanders using hot springs appear in the Íslendingabók, Book of the Icelanders, and the Sagas. These sources mention that some farmsteads were built deliberately close to geothermal pools, where settlers could bathe, wash clothes, and even warm drinking water in winter. Bathing wasn't merely about cleanliness. In a world where winters were long and food scarce, warmth itself was a form of survival. One of the oldest surviving man-made baths in Iceland is Snorri's Pool, in Reykholt. Built in the 13th century, it is named for Snorri Sturluson, the famed saga writer, poet, and politician. Snorri had a circular stone pool constructed over a hot spring, with a short tunnel leading from his home so he could bathe in privacy. Imagine it, steam rising from the pool, snow piled high around the stones, and Snorri himself sinking into the water after a day of political intrigue. Snorralag is more than just an archaeological curiosity. It shows that by the medieval period, Icelanders were not only using hot springs, but engineering them into proper bathing spaces. A step beyond simply sitting in a natural pool. Hot springs were not always for leisure. Many farmhouses had wooden tubs or small rock-lined pits fed by diverted hot water. These were used for washing wool, curing hides, or preparing large quantities of food. In some geothermal areas, hot ground itself was used as an oven. Icelanders would bury dough or meat in the earth, returning hours later to find it cooked by volcanic heat. For families living far from the few warm rivers and pools, bathing could be rare in winter. But for those in geothermal districts, warm water made regular washing possible, even in the darkest months. This may have been one reason Iceland developed a reputation among foreign travelers for being a cleaner society than many parts of medieval Europe. From early on, hot springs were thought to have curative powers. The warmth was said to ease joint pain, heal wounds, and drive out cold illnesses. A vague but meaningful term in a climate where damp chills were a constant threat. The minerals in the water, though not yet understood in a chemical sense, were noticed. Some springs left a slippery residue on the skin. Others had a faint sulfur smell, and locals swore that certain pools could soothe skin conditions. This belief in geothermal healing fit neatly into Norse cosmology, where the elements were forces to be respected and harnessed. To bathe in a hot spring was, in a sense, to take the earth's power into your body. In small communities, hot springs could become gathering places. People met there to exchange news, discuss farm work, or arrange marriages. In the sagas, there are hints of disputes and even political negotiations happening at bathing sites. It was difficult to remain hostile when sharing warm water on a freezing day. Of course, there were rules of etiquette. Bathers were expected to be respectful, and certain pools were designated for men, women, or special purposes. Overcrowding was avoided where possible, and travelers arriving at a spring were often welcomed, as long as they observed local customs. As the centuries went on, Icelanders' relationship with their hot springs deepened. They became not just places of survival, but symbols of comfort, healing, and community identity. And yet, these same springs would also attract the interest of outsiders, traders, scientists, and travelers, who would begin to change how they were used and understood. By the early modern period, Iceland's hot springs were no longer just the concern of farmers and local communities. As trade with the outside world increased from the 17th century onward, Iceland's geothermal features began to draw the attention of foreign merchants, scholars, and occasional adventurers. The pools and steaming vents that locals treated as everyday conveniences were, to outsiders, exotic marvels worthy of study, and sometimes exploitation. One of the earliest detailed foreign accounts comes from 18th century travelers like Eggert Hilafsson and Jarni Pierluson, who explored Iceland's landscapes and described its hot springs in writing. They documented places like Reykjavíkur's Steam Valley, where clouds of vapor rose from bubbling pools scattered across the hills. To them, These were not just picturesque features. They were examples of a living, breathing earth. In their reports, these travelers noted how locals diverted spring water for washing wool, cooking, and bathing. Some even used the water to heat small greenhouses, where hardy plants could survive Iceland's short summer. It was a reminder that in a harsh climate, geothermal energy could be as vital as food or shelter. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe was in the midst of a health spa craze. In places like Bath in England or Baden in Germany, mineral waters were thought to cure everything from gout to melancholy. It was only a matter of time before word spread that Iceland, remote though it was, had an entire island full of naturally heated mineral baths. This foreign curiosity led to some early attempts at medical tourism. Although Iceland's isolation meant visitors were rare, wealthy Danes and Norwegians, Iceland being under Danish rule at the time, occasionally visited hot spring areas like Laugavan. These trips were far from comfortable. There were no grand hotels, only farmhouses or temporary lodgings, and travelers often had to share space with livestock. Still, the idea of Iceland as a land of healing waters was beginning to take root. Laugavan, a lake in southwestern Iceland, fed by geothermal springs, became one of the first organized bathing spots. Locals had long used the naturally warm shallows for washing and bathing. By the late 19th century, small wooden structures had been built to offer modest changing facilities. It was still a far cry from the ornate European spa complexes, but the location began to gain a reputation for soothing sore muscles and respiratory complaints. An early visitor described sitting waist deep in the lake, steam curling off the surface while a cold wind ruffled the water. The sensation of warm water on the body and icy air on the face was, they wrote, at once invigorating and strangely tranquil. For most Icelanders of the 18th and 19th centuries, however, hot springs remained practical rather than luxurious. In places like Havagerey, hot water was piped through rudimentary channels to heat homes, cook food, and even warm outdoor animal pens in winter. Farmers continued to use springs for scalding wool before spinning, a step that improved the texture and cleanliness of the fibers. Bathing was often done in open-air pools, with simple privacy screens at best. There was little thought of spa culture, as understood in Europe. For rural Icelanders, hot water was simply another tool for survival, much like fishing gear or a well-stocked larder. By the late 19th century, Iceland was beginning to modernize, and geothermal energy caught the attention of engineers. While the first major geothermal power projects would not come until the 20th century, the groundwork was laid when Icelanders started to see their hot springs not only as personal conveniences, but as a shared national resource. Some communities began regulating access to certain pools, especially those believed to have medicinal benefits. Local councils discussed how to preserve the springs from overuse or contamination, early hints of what would later become Iceland's geothermal conservation policies. This period was one of balance. Traditional use of hot springs as communal, open-air spaces coexisted with the first signs of organized bathing culture and tourism. Rural families still boiled food in the earth, washed clothes in steaming streams, and bathed under the open sky. But in a few places, small bathhouses began to appear. For Icelanders, the springs were not yet attractions in the foreign sense. They were woven into the fabric of life, familiar and dependable, as much a part of the landscape as the mountains and the sea. The stage was set for a transformation. In the 20th century, Iceland's hot springs would undergo a dramatic shift, from humble village pools to internationally famous health destinations, powered by advances in geothermal engineering and fueled by a growing fascination with the island's otherworldly landscapes. By the dawn of the 20th century, Iceland's hot springs were on the cusp of a transformation unlike anything in their long history. For centuries they had been local conveniences, places to wash, cook, and sometimes heal. But in the decades ahead, they would be reborn as symbols of national pride, engines of energy independence, and magnets for visitors from across the world. The first major leap came in 1908, when Reykjavik experimented with piping geothermal water directly into buildings. At first, it was an improvised affair wooden pipes carried hot water from a single borehole to a handful of homes and a school. The results were promising. Rooms stayed warm without coal or peat, and there was a constant supply of hot water. By the 1930s, the city had committed fully to geothermal heating. New drilling projects tapped deeper into the earth, providing more reliable flows. Concrete pipes replaced wooden ones, and entire neighborhoods were linked to the system. In a country with no native coal and limited forests for fuel, geothermal power was a revolution. It didn't just make bathing easier, it reshaped Iceland's economy and quality of life. As geothermal systems expanded, Reykjavik and other towns began building public bathhouses. These were not ornate in the style of continental Europe's grand spas. They were practical, functional spaces where people could soak in hot pools, swim in heated water, and enjoy steam rooms. The Sundal Reykjavik Swimming Hall, opened in 1937, became a landmark. It offered indoor pools, warm baths, and steam rooms heated entirely by geothermal energy. For many Icelanders, these bathhouses were more than places to get clean. They became hubs of social life, where news was exchanged and friendships formed in the enveloping warmth. One of Iceland's most famous geothermal attractions, the Blue Lagoon, began not as a luxury spa but as an accident. In 1976, a geothermal power plant near Grindavik discharged mineral-rich water into a nearby lava field. Locals began bathing in the warm runoff, finding it soothing for skin conditions such as psoriasis. By the 1990s, the site had been developed into a formal bathing complex. Its surreal, milky blue waters, caused by silica suspended in the water, became an icon of Iceland's modern identity. Today, the Blue Lagoon is one of the most visited places in the country, but its origins remain a testament to Iceland's long tradition of making practical use of hot water before turning it into an experience. With growing international attention came challenges. Icelanders had always viewed hot springs as communal resources, but the rise of tourism brought pressure on delicate natural sites. Pools like Landmannalaugar, once the domain of hardy hikers, began attracting larger crowds. Some sites were closed to protect them from overuse, while others were developed with facilities to handle more visitors. Still, in many small towns, the old customs persisted. Locals continued to gather in small geothermal pools after work, sometimes under the northern lights in winter. For them, the springs were not primarily a tourist attraction, they were part of everyday life. Today, geothermal water heats around 90% of Icelandic homes and provides much of the island's electricity. Public hot tubs, known as heita potta, are fixtures in nearly every community. They serve as modern-day equivalents of the old village pools, where people relax, chat, and share news. In rural areas, bathing in natural springs is still a treasured ritual. Some pools are little more than shallow rock basins beside a stream, reached by a hike across mossy lava fields. Others, like Lagervatnsfontana, combine traditional soaking with geothermal baking. Bread dough is buried in hot sand near the springs, then dug up hours later to be eaten fresh. For Icelanders, hot springs have become more than sources of warmth or tourist revenue. They are a symbol of resilience. In a country with a harsh climate and long, dark winters, they represent comfort, community, and the ability to turn the raw forces of nature into a source of life. The journey from medieval bathing pools to cutting-edge geothermal spas is not just a story about technology or tourism. It's about a culture that has always found ways to live with the land's extremes, using what the earth offers, not just to survive, but to thrive. And yet, as more people from around the globe seek the soothing heat of Iceland's waters, a question lingers: can the island preserve the quiet, communal spirit of its hot springs in the face of growing demand, or will the world's fascination slowly transform them into something unrecognizable?